Small towns hide the darkest secrets, empty main streets, forgotten churches, and places too quiet to trust. Tonight, you'll hear 13 encounters that prove some places should stay abandoned. If you survive all 13 stories, hit that subscribe button and join Verified Souls, because we're just getting started. Sheila had spent years chasing adrenaline and silence, breaking into abandoned buildings to photograph the echoes of lives long since faded. But the old mining town of Gallows End promised her more than memory and dust. Unlike most forgotten places, there were rumors about this one. Stories about the church on the hill where the lights never truly went out, where the hymns could still be heard, drifting on the midnight wind. For a town marked condemned on every modern map, Gallows End had left a trail of caution among even the boldest urban explorers. It was said that if you went there after dark, you had to be out by sunrise, and you never, ever entered the church. But it takes only a daring heart and the promise of rare photographs for warnings to melt away. She drove in secret, using side roads that twisted through dead oaks and rusted railroad crossings, leaving behind her friends waiting with gear in the next county. The mines had collapsed decades earlier. The last census had listed 0 residents, and the main thoroughfare was choked with weeds tall as her shoulders. The church tower, white paint peeling beneath centuries of storms, rose above the clinging fog. Sheila parked, slinging her camera bag over her shoulder and glancing up just in time to see the tower clock shutter, stuck at 3 minutes past midnight. The wooden doors were heavy, carved with crosses that looked too old for their purpose, and they surrendered with a sigh, opening into a sanctuary that seemed both vast and suffocating. The pews stood in perfect rows, free of dust or decay, as though waiting for worshippers delayed only by traffic and the trivial weight of mortality. She walked forward, nerves buzzing in her fingertips, flash at the ready. Her boots made no sound on the wooden floor, the silence unbroken except for the hum, low, constant, like the open throat of an organ. Her attention snagged on the altar, covered in fresh white cloth, a Bible open to an indecipherable page, its letters warped and blurred in ways her camera couldn't focus. Sheila lifted her lens, aiming for the stained glass above, but the next sound froze her mid-shot. Footsteps, whispered conversation. The church doors behind her parted again, wide and easy, and the congregation filtered inside with soft rustling, their faces expressionless, their Sunday best pressed and pristine, untouched by time or weather. Every pew was filled, each seat occupied by a body that somehow shimmered around the edges, unfocused and inconsistent like old film. Sheila's breath caught. The people moved and gestured, but they didn't seem to notice her. She wasn't part of their ritual and had no business among them unless she wished to join in permanent worship. She tried to move, tried to leave, but her legs wouldn't obey. The color in the glass spilled over the masses, giving oddly sharp outlines. One woman clasped a hymn book upside down. A child twisted in his seat, staring at the ceiling. At the front, the minister, too thin, face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, raised his arms. "Let us pray," he intoned, and the air thickened until Sheila was choking on invisible dust. Each head bowed in unison, their mouths opening wide to recite words she could not hear. Her camera flashed of its own accord, sending a spear of reflected light across the pulpit. The minister's head snapped up, eyes locking to hers, black and deep as the collapsed mine shafts beyond town. "You're late," he said, his voice echoing inside her skull. The congregation turned, faces splitting into smiles that looked rehearsed, mouths stretching beyond the boundaries of human anatomy. Their voices rose as one, a dissonant hymn, syllables twisting and layering, filling the room until the windows rattled. Sheila staggered backward, slamming her shoulder against the doors, but they would not move. The air grew thick as syrup, every shadow bending toward her like arms, reaching from below the floorboards. And the hymn wrapped around her thoughts, smothering the sense of self she'd always depended on to find her way back from terror's edge. "You're late," the minister repeated, now standing directly at the altar, hands dripping with something black and viscous that dripped but vanished before it ever touched the ground. Service began 40 years ago. The doors only open for those who will stay until the final hymn. Sheila shook her head, trying to break the fog invading her mind. Her lens hung useless, capturing nothing but blur and streaks of light that painted sorrow across every image. She desperately flipped through memories. Every rule she'd ever read about haunted places, every warning about churches and endless prayers. But nothing prepared her for the honest, devastating truth. She was already fading. Her edges were losing definition, her thoughts growing sluggish. The congregation sang louder. Each verse stretched for minutes, hours. Time had no meaning in a place designed for eternity. Sheila fought for clarity, focusing on a single child in the front row. A little boy whose eyes shimmered blue. He turned to meet her gaze, lips stilling mid-hymn. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but her own voice had withered to shreds that hung heavy in the air and never reached the child's ears. The minister stretched longer, bones protruding, hat wide and deep. With every word he uttered, the church ceiling seemed to bow and pulse, the images, painted in glass, shifting like memories refusing to stay locked away. "You mustn't leave before dawn," a whisper came, so close she felt breath on her ear even though the pews remained full. "That's the rule. If you stay, you become one of us. If you leave before the final hymn, the town will follow you." Sheila scrabbled in her bag, wrenching out her phone in a last desperate act. No signal, only an array of missed alarms, blinking midnight on repeat. The congregation's hymn began to fracture, breaking into laughter and wails, voices blurring and layering so rapidly that her head spun. The minister approached, taking her hand in a grip so cold and old she felt she'd been touched by history itself. "You're here," he whispered, "because something called you. Something always calls. Some need to know the mysteries best, left to rot beneath hymnals and stained glass. None escape." Sheila tried to scream, the sound bending and flattening into the chorus. As the congregation rose, all faces locked on hers. The minister tilted his head, lips stretching forward, voice growing deep as the mine shaft that birthed the town's legend. "Sing with us." The words were both invitation and demand, a tether tying her to the pews, forcing her mouth into the shape of a refrain she didn't know, her mind filling with words in dead languages. Sheila's memories blurred. She tried to recall her life before the church, her ambitions, her friends, but the hymn consumed them, rewrote them, blended them into a single desire to sing. Time melted into a syrupy fog. Shadows shifted as the night outside deepened, and the congregation began to blur, faces melting into one another, hands merging and splitting like ink dropped in water. For hours, months, decades she sang. She became part of the congregation. Her existence stretched between hymnal verses, suspended between daybreaks. But as the first rays of sunlight pressed against the stained glass, the minister turned, hat drooping over his withered face. "Service ends with dawn's first light," he announced, and the congregation stilled, rising as one in a rattle of bones and hope and regret. The doors creaked, surrendering to a breeze filled with dust and the scent of long-forgotten lilies. The pews emptied, each figure fading to shadow, leaving Sheila alone beneath the trembling glass. She could move again, her body once again her own, though changed and hollow where the midnight hymn had carved itself. She staggered for her camera. The images failed to render. Each memory of the night collapsed and fractured, a horror so great the lens itself abhorred it. Sheila bolted down the hill, out into Gallows End, racing toward the car that looked older than she remembered, tires sunken and frame tangled in weeds that had grown overnight. The clock tower in the church shuddered and spun, hands setting themselves to 4:44. 3 minutes past midnight, nowhere and forever. She started the engine, fighting the urge to glance in the rear view, knowing instinctively that she'd find pews filled with faces, each one singing her name in voices layered with eternity. She never spoke of the church. She never returned to haunted places, never sought adrenaline in silence or memory. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she hears the hymn again, the same refrain in a dialect older than the town itself. The photographs she'd tried to capture remained warped and grim, each image flickering with dozens of faces, layered like warnings. Gallows End was declared unsafe, the church condemned for demolition a month after her visit. But on some frozen nights, when the wind is just right, locals swear they can hear voices singing on the hill, a hymn too old for any living congregation. No one who's entered the church after midnight has ever been seen in daylight again. And if you've stayed with Sheila to the end of this tale, remember, some doors open only once, and some hymns are designed to be eternal. Subscribe to Verified Souls and share your own stories from wherever you escaped and from whichever congregation calls after midnight. Sheila had spent years chasing adrenaline in silence, breaking into abandoned buildings to photograph the echoes of lives long since faded. But the old mining town of Gallows End promised her more than memory and dust. Unlike most forgotten places, there were rumors about this one. Stories about the church on the hill where the lights never truly went out, where the hymns could still be heard, drifting on the midnight wind. For a town marked condemned on every modern map, Gallows End had left a trail of caution among even the boldest urban explorers. It was said that if you went there after dark, you had to be out by sunrise, and you never, ever entered the church. But it takes only a daring heart and the promise of rare photographs for warnings to melt away. She drove in secret, using side roads that twisted through dead oaks and rusted railroad crossings, leaving behind her friends waiting with gear in the next county. The mines had collapsed decades earlier. The last census had listed 0 residents, and the main thoroughfare was choked with weeds tall as her shoulders. The church tower, white paint peeling beneath centuries of storms, rose above the clinging fog. Sheila parked, slinging her camera bag over her shoulder and glancing up just in time to see the tower clock shutter, stuck at 3 minutes past midnight. The wooden doors were heavy, carved with crosses that looked too old for their purpose, and they surrendered with a sigh, opening into a sanctuary that seemed both vast and suffocating. The pews stood in perfect rows, free of dust or decay, as though waiting for worshippers delayed only by traffic and the trivial weight of mortality. She walked forward, nerves buzzing in her fingertips, flash at the ready. Her boots made no sound on the wooden floor, the silence unbroken except for the hum, low, constant, like the open throat of an organ. Her attention snagged on the altar, covered in fresh white cloth, a Bible open to an indecipherable page, its letters warped and blurred in ways her camera couldn't focus. Sheila lifted her lens, aiming for the stained glass above, but the next sound froze her mid-shot. Footsteps, whispered conversation. The church doors behind her parted again, wide and easy, and the congregation filtered inside with soft rustling, their faces expressionless, their Sunday best pressed and pristine, untouched by time or weather. Every pew was filled, each seat occupied by a body that somehow shimmered around the edges, unfocused and inconsistent like old film. Sheila's breath caught. The people moved and gestured, but they didn't seem to notice her. She wasn't part of their ritual and had no business among them unless she wished to join in permanent worship. She tried to move, tried to leave, but her legs wouldn't obey. The color in the glass spilled over the masses, giving oddly sharp outlines. One woman clasped a hymn book upside down. A child twisted in his seat, staring at the ceiling. At the front, the minister, too thin, face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, raised his arms. "Let us pray," he intoned, and the air thickened until Sheila was choking on invisible dust. Each head bowed in unison, their mouths opening wide to recite words she could not hear. Her camera flashed of its own accord, sending a spear of reflected light across the pulpit. The minister's head snapped up, eyes locking to hers, black and deep as the collapsed mineshafts beyond town. "You're late," he said, his voice echoing inside her skull. The congregation turned, faces splitting into smiles that looked rehearsed, mouths stretching beyond the boundaries of human anatomy. Their voices rose as one, a dissonant hymn, syllables twisting and layering, filling the room until the windows rattled. Sheila staggered backward, slamming her shoulder against the doors, but they would not move. The air grew thick as syrup, every shadow bending toward her like arms, reaching from below the floorboards. And the hymn wrapped around her thoughts, smothering the sense of self she'd always depended on to find her way back from terror's edge. "You're late," the minister repeated, now standing directly at the altar, hands dripping with something black and viscous that dripped but vanished before it ever touched the ground. Service began 40 years ago. The doors only open for those who will stay until the final hymn. Sheila shook her head, trying to break the fog invading her mind. Her lens hung useless, capturing nothing but blur and streaks of light that painted sorrow across every image. She desperately flipped through memories. Every rule she'd ever read about haunted places, every warning about churches and endless prayers. But nothing prepared her for the honest, devastating truth. She was already fading. Her edges were losing definition, her thoughts growing sluggish. The congregation sang louder. Each verse stretched for minutes, hours. Time had no meaning in a place designed for eternity. Sheila fought for clarity, focusing on a single child in the front row. A little boy whose eyes shimmered blue. He turned to meet her gaze, lips stilling mid-hymn. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but her own voice had withered to shreds that hung heavy in the air and never reached the child's ears. The minister stretched longer, bones protruding, hat wide and deep. With every word he uttered, the church ceiling seemed to bow and pulse, the images, painted in glass, shifting like memories refusing to stay locked away. "You mustn't leave before dawn," a whisper came, so close she felt breath on her ear even though the pews remained full. "That's the rule. If you stay, you become one of us. If you leave before the final hymn, the town will follow you." Sheila scrabbled in her bag, wrenching out her phone in a last desperate act. No signal, only an array of missed alarms, blinking midnight on repeat. The congregation's hymn began to fracture, breaking into laughter and wails, voices blurring and layering so rapidly that her head spun. The minister approached, taking her hand in a grip so cold and old she felt she'd been touched by history itself. "You're here," he whispered, "because something called you. Something always calls. Some need to know the mysteries best, left to rot beneath hymnals and stained glass. None escape." Sheila tried to scream, the sound bending and flattening into the chorus. As the congregation rose, all faces locked on hers. The minister tilted his head, lips stretching forward, voice growing deep as the mine shaft that birthed the town's legend. "Sing with us." The words were both invitation and demand, a tether tying her to the pews, forcing her mouth into the shape of a refrain she didn't know, her mind filling with words in dead languages. Sheila's memories blurred. She tried to recall her life before the church, her ambitions, her friends, but the hymn consumed them, rewrote them, blended them into a single desire to sing. Time melted into a syrupy fog. Shadows shifted as the night outside deepened, and the congregation began to blur, faces melting into one another, hands merging and splitting like ink dropped in water. For hours, months, decades she sang. She became part of the congregation. Her existence stretched between hymnal verses, suspended between daybreaks. But as the first rays of sunlight pressed against the stained glass, the minister turned, hat drooping over his withered face. "Service ends with dawn's first light," he announced, and the congregation stilled, rising as one in a rattle of bones and hope and regret. The doors creaked, surrendering to a breeze filled with dust and the scent of long-forgotten lilies. The pews emptied, each figure fading to shadow, leaving Sheila alone beneath the trembling glass. She could move again, her body once again her own, though changed and hollow where the midnight hymn had carved itself. She staggered for her camera. The images failed to render. Each memory of the night collapsed and fractured, a horror so great the lens itself abhorred it. Sheila bolted down the hill, out into Gallows End, racing toward the car that looked older than she remembered, tires sunken and frame tangled in weeds that had grown overnight. The clock tower in the church shuddered and spun, hand setting themselves to 4:44. 3 minutes past midnight, nowhere and forever. She started the engine, fighting the urge to glance in the rear view, knowing instinctively that she'd find pews filled with faces, each one singing her name in voices layered with eternity. She never spoke of the church. She never returned to haunted places, never sought adrenaline in silence or memory. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she hears the hymn again, the same refrain in a dialect older than the town itself. The photographs she'd tried to capture remained warped and grim, each image flickering with dozens of faces, layered like warnings. Gallows End was declared unsafe, the church condemned for demolition a month after her visit. But on some frozen nights, when the wind is just right, locals swear they can hear voices singing on the hill, a hymn too old for any living congregation. No one who's entered the church after midnight has ever been seen in daylight again. And if you've stayed with Sheila to the end of this tale, remember, some doors open only once, and some hymns are designed to be eternal. Subscribe to Verified Souls and share your own stories from wherever you escaped and from whichever congregation calls after midnight. Marcus took the job because he was desperate, because the pay was twice what any cemetery should offer for basic maintenance, and because the old groundskeeper who interviewed him had eyes that said he wouldn't last a month anyway. Pine Haven Cemetery sat at the edge of Coldwater, a nothing town pressed against pine forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated past noon. The job was simple: mow the grass, tend the graves, lock the gates at sunset, and above all else, be gone before 9 p.m. Feeding time, the old man had said, his weathered face cracking into something between a smile and a grimace. You don't want to be here for feeding time. Marcus had laughed it off as small-town superstition, the kind of ghost story meant to scare off lazy workers. He'd grown up in Detroit, had seen real danger, real violence. He wasn't about to be spooked by some backwoods cemetery and its eccentric traditions. The first week passed without incident. The work was peaceful, almost meditative, and Marcus found himself enjoying the quiet routine of trimming hedges and clearing leaves from headstones that dated back to the 1800s. The cemetery bordered the forest on 3 sides, a thick wall of pines that seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. On his 5th day, Marcus noticed something odd. Several graves near the forest edge showed signs of disturbance. The earth churned and scattered despite being freshly settled. He'd filled them in, patted down the soil, assumed it was animals or erosion. But the next morning, they were disturbed again, worse this time, as if something had been digging from above, or trying to pull the contents below ground toward the trees. He mentioned it to the old groundskeeper during his weekly check-in, and the man's face had gone pale. Which graves? He'd demanded. When Marcus showed him, pointing to 5 plots in a neat row, all recent burials within the past month, the old man had actually stepped backward. You're filling them in before sunset, right? You're leaving before 9? Marcus nodded, confused by the urgency. Then it's handling it, the old man muttered. It's doing what we agreed. Marcus should have quit right then, should have recognized the fear in the old man's voice as genuine rather than performative. But curiosity is a hook that catches deeper than fear, and he found himself staying later each evening, watching the graves, waiting to see what would disturb them. On the 14th night, he hid behind the maintenance shed with a flashlight and his phone camera, determined to catch whatever animal was destroying his work. The sun set at 7:45, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. By 8:30, the cemetery had fallen into that particular darkness that exists only in places where the living don't linger, a blackness so complete it seemed to have texture and weight. At exactly 9 p.m., Marcus heard it. Not footsteps or growling, but something worse, a rhythmic scraping, like massive claws dragging across stone, accompanied by a wet, labored breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He pressed himself against the shed, phone raised and recording, as the sound moved closer. What emerged from the forest wasn't an animal, at least not anything that should exist outside of nightmares and evolutionary dead ends. It walked on 6 legs, each one jointed wrong, bending in places that defied anatomy. Its body was covered in matted fur and exposed patches of skin that glistened like raw meat, and its head, if it could be called a head, was a mass of eyes and teeth arranged in no pattern that made biological sense. The thing moved with terrible purpose, heading straight for the disturbed graves, and Marcus watched in frozen horror as it began to dig. Not with paws or claws, but with appendages that sprouted from its torso, long and thin and ending in something like hands but with too many fingers. It dug quickly, efficiently, and within minutes had unearthed the first coffin. What happened next would replay in Marcus's mind for years afterward, in therapy sessions and screaming nightmares, and moments when he caught his reflection and saw the memory burning behind his own eyes. The creature fed. It tore through the coffin lid like paper, and the sounds that followed, the wet crunching, the splintering of bone, the satisfied grunts, were worse than anything Marcus had ever heard in Detroit's worst neighborhoods. When it finished with the first grave, it moved to the second, then the third, working its way through all 5 disturbed plots with mechanical efficiency. Marcus remained paralyzed behind the shed, his phone still recording, though his hands shook so badly the footage would later be unwatchable. The creature finished feeding around midnight, its misshapen body somehow larger, more substantial, as if the act of consuming the dead had made it more real. It turned then, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that it was looking at him, that despite the darkness and his hiding place, it knew exactly where he crouched. One of its many eyes, a yellow slitted thing near what might have been a shoulder, fixed on his position, and the creature's breathing changed, quickening with what might have been anticipation or hunger. Marcus ran. He abandoned his phone, his flashlight, his dignity, and sprinted for the cemetery gates with the sound of 6-legged pursuit scraping behind him. The creature was fast, impossibly fast, and he could feel its breath on his neck, could hear the clicking of its teeth inches from his spine. He cleared the gates with seconds to spare, stumbling onto the public road beyond, and the creature stopped, as if hitting an invisible wall. It stood at the cemetery boundary, all its eyes watching him, and then it spoke. The voice was wrong, layered, as if a dozen different people were speaking in imperfect unison. "The arrangement holds," it said. "The town feeds me the fresh dead, and I stay in the forest. I stay away from the living." Marcus stared, his chest heaving, unable to process what he was hearing. "But you watched," the creature continued, taking a step closer to the boundary, testing it. "You witnessed. That complicates things." It tilted its malformed head, eyes blinking in sequence like a wave across its body. "The town has kept this bargain for 137 years, since the mining accident, since they buried 63 men in a single day, and I crawled up from the collapsed shaft, hungry and changed. We made a deal. I take only the dead who are buried near the forest. I take them quietly, and the town pretends I don't exist." Marcus found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "What happens now?" The creature seemed to consider this, its breathing slowing to a rhythmic wheeze. Now you have a choice. You can leave Coldwater and never speak of what you've seen, or you can stay and join the arrangement. Become a groundskeeper who knows, who prepares the feeding, who keeps the bargain alive. Marcus didn't return to the cemetery. He didn't collect his final paycheck or stop by his rented room to gather his belongings. He drove straight through the night, putting as many miles as possible between himself and Coldwater, between himself and the thing that fed on the dead in exchange for leaving the living alone. But distance doesn't erase knowledge, and knowledge doesn't fade just because you've fled. He learned later, through internet searches and archived newspaper articles, that Coldwater had an unusually high number of burials, considering its small population. That families from surrounding towns often chose Pine Haven Cemetery for their deceased, drawn by low costs and the groundskeeper's reputation for respectful care. That the town had no missing persons cases, no unexplained deaths, no violence beyond the occasional bar fight. The bargain was working. The creature kept its end, and the town kept feeding it the dead, maintaining a grotesque peace built on secrets and selective blindness. Marcus never told anyone what he'd seen, not fully, not in detail. How do you explain that some towns survive by feeding monsters, that some bargains are written in flesh instead of paper, that the boundary between the living and the dead is sometimes patrolled by things that belong to neither category? He moved to Phoenix, as far from forests and small towns as he could manage, and tried to rebuild a life that didn't include memories of six-legged hunger and graves that served as dinner plates. But sometimes, late at night, he thinks about the old groundskeeper, about the man's resignation and fear and the way he'd asked which graves were disturbed. He thinks about the families who buried their loved ones at Pine Haven, unknowing and grateful for the affordable rates. He thinks about the creature in the forest, patient and eternal, waiting for 9 p.m. in the feast that their town provides like clockwork, and he wonders how many other small towns have made similar arrangements, what other bargains exist in the shadows of America's forgotten places, and whether the boundaries that protect us are as solid as we'd like to believe. The sign appeared exactly when Jamie needed it most. White letters on green metal, promising civilization after 3 hours of empty highway and a gas tank hovering near empty. Welcome to Ashmont, population 847, it declared with small-town cheerfulness. And Jamie felt relief flood through tired muscles as the road curved into what looked like a perfectly preserved slice of 1950s Americana. Main Street stretched ahead with its barbershop pole, its corner drugstore, its diner with red vinyl booths visible through spotless windows. Jamie pulled into the gas station, noting with mild surprise that it was full service. An attendant already walking over with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The man filled the tank without speaking, accepted cash without comment, and returned to his post beside the pumps, where he stood motionless, watching Jamie's car with an intensity that felt almost accusatory. Unsettled but chalking it up to small-town strangeness, Jamie decided to grab coffee at the diner before continuing the drive to Seattle for a job interview that was already feeling like a mistake. The diner's interior was clean to the point of sterility, every surface gleaming, every napkin holder filled to exact capacity. A waitress appeared instantly, her uniform crisp and her smile mechanical, pouring coffee without asking if Jamie wanted any. "Just passing through," Jamie said, trying to break the silence that hung thick despite the jukebox playing something instrumental and forgettable in the corner. The waitress nodded, still smiling, still saying nothing, and retreated behind the counter where she stood perfectly still, hands folded, eyes fixed on Jamie with the same unnerving intensity as the gas station attendant. Jamie drank the coffee quickly, left cash on the table, and walked back outside into afternoon sunshine that felt somehow wrong, too bright and too sharp, casting shadows at angles that didn't match the sun's position. The car was where it had been left, But as Jamie climbed inside and started the engine, something caught their eye in the rearview mirror. The population sign at the edge of town, now facing the opposite direction as Jamie prepared to leave, had changed. "Welcome to Ashmont Population 846. Jamie's hands froze on the steering wheel. That was impossible. The sign had read 847 less than 20 minutes ago. Tricks of light, misremembering, stress from the long drive. Rational explanations cycled through Jamie's mind as the car rolled forward, following the main road out of town. But the road curved back on itself, depositing the car onto Main Street from the opposite direction, and there ahead was the welcome sign again, green and white, and impossible. "Welcome to Ashmont Population 845. Jamie slammed on the brakes, heart hammering against ribs that suddenly felt too tight. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Jamie threw the car into reverse, spinning back toward the center of town. But every turn led back to Main Street. Every attempt to escape looped around to the same stretch of road, and each time the sign changed. 844, 843, 842. The numbers were counting down, and Jamie realized with crawling horror that the town wasn't losing people. It was counting something else. Counting attempts to leave, counting failures, counting down to zero. Panic made Jamie reckless. The car screeched through turns, accelerated past the barbershop and the drugstore and the gas station where the attendant still stood watching, his smile wider now, knowing. But physics and geography meant nothing in Ashmont. Every road was the same road. Every attempt to escape was another revolution in a loop that grew tighter with each passing minute. 836, 831, 825. The numbers fell faster now, as if the town was growing impatient, as if it knew Jamie was beginning to understand the rules of a game that had been rigged from the moment the welcome sign first appeared. Jamie pulled over in front of the diner, hands shaking, mind racing through possibilities and physics and the growing certainty that logic had no place here. The waitress stood in the window, still smiling, and Jamie saw others now. The attendant, the barber, a woman with a shopping bag, a man in a postal uniform, all standing motionless on the sidewalks, all watching with eyes that reflected nothing, all waiting for the count to reach its inevitable conclusion. Jamie forced calm into lungs that wanted to hyperventilate, forced thought into a brain that wanted to shut down. The sign was counting something, and if it reached zero, something terrible would happen. But what was it counting? Attempts to leave didn't make sense. The number was too high, was falling too fast, unless it wasn't counting Jamie's attempts. Jamie grabbed a notebook from the passenger seat, started writing down the numbers, trying to find a pattern. 814, 809, 801. The decreases weren't consistent, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, sometimes 9. Jamie drove out of town again, watching the sign change, 7 to 25, then immediately turned around and drove back through, watching it drop to 788. 7 that time. Jamie circled the block in town, staying within Ashmont's boundaries, and the number held steady. The count only changed when attempting to cross the town line. It was measuring something about the attempts themselves, something about the act of trying to leave. Then it clicked with the force of revelation that felt like ice water through the veins. The sign had read 847 when Jamie entered. Every attempt to leave decreased the number. The town was counting down from its population. Each failed escape was subtracting someone, not from the town but from existence. Jamie's mind reeled with the implications. If the count reached zero, Jamie would cease to exist, would be erased, unmade, subtracted from reality, like a number crossing out another number. The people on the sidewalks weren't waiting. They were what remained of others who'd tried to leave, shells without substance, echoes preserved by the town as decoration and warning. Jamie needed to stop trying to leave, needed to find another way, needed to solve whatever puzzle Ashmont represented before the population counter reached zero and took Jamie with it. 783, 776, 768. Even thinking about leaving seemed to lower the count, as if the town could sense intention, could measure desire, and punish it with mathematical precision. Jamie parked in front of the library, a building noticed only now because the mind had been too focused on escape to register details. Inside, the shelves were stocked with books that looked real, but opened to pages of nonsense text, letters arranged in patterns that hurt to read. But in the reference section, Jamie found something different. A ledger, handwritten, listing names and dates going back decades, travelers, all of them, people passing through, and next to each name, a number, the population count when they'd entered Ashmont. Some lists went on for pages, hundreds of entries showing their desperate attempts to leave, the numbers dropping with each recorded effort until they reached single digits, then zero, and then their names appeared again in a different section. Permanent residents. The shells on the sidewalk, the waitress, and the attendant, and all the others. They'd lost the count, had been subtracted down to nothing and absorbed into Ashmont's strange mathematics. But there were exceptions. 3 names in the ledger were marked solved in red ink. Jamie flipped to their entries frantically, searching for clues. Each had entered with different population numbers, 531, 622, 714. But they'd all left somehow, had beaten Ashmont's equation. Their pages showed something the others didn't. Moments where the count increased instead of decreased, where population went up instead of down. Jamie studied the patterns, brain working through the puzzle even as the count continued its downward spiral. 741, 736, 729. The increases happened when they'd done something for the town, when they'd added value instead of trying to subtract themselves. One had repaired the church roof. Another had cataloged the library's collection. The third had painted a mural on the post office wall. They'd contributed. They'd increased Ashmont's worth, and in return the town had increased their count, had given them back what they'd lost and more, until they'd accumulated enough population to leave. Jamie had nothing to offer a town frozen in time. No skills for repair, no art to contribute, no labor to trade for the numbers needed to escape. But the ledger itself was incomplete, its pages disorganized, its entries chaotic. Jamie spent the next hours organizing it, creating an index, cross-referencing dates and outcomes, building a comprehensive record of Ashmont's visitors and their fates. The work was meticulous and exhausting, and Jamie checked the sign periodically through the library window, watching the count stabilize, 701, holding steady as long as escape wasn't attempted. When the ledger was finished, when every name was indexed and every pattern documented, Jamie walked outside and looked at the sign. Welcome to Ashmont, population 701. Then, as Jamie watched, it flickered, changed. Welcome to Ashmont, population 798. The number had jumped nearly 100. The town had accepted the contribution, had valued the organization of its records, had returned what it had taken, and added more. Jamie got in the car, heart pounding, and drove toward the town line. The sign changed as the boundary approached, but this time it increased. 799, 803, 809. Each attempt to leave was adding instead of subtracting, the surplus population serving as currency for escape. At 847, the original number from when Jamie had entered, the road straightened. The loop broke. The highway extended ahead into normal geography and normal physics, and Ashmont disappeared in the rearview mirror like morning mist burned away by rational sunlight. Jamie drove for 6 hours straight, didn't stop until crossing state lines, and never spoke of the town where population was mathematics and contribution was survival. But sometimes, on empty highways in the strange hours between midnight and dawn, Jamie sees signs for towns that shouldn't exist, population numbers that don't match any census, and knows enough to keep driving until the sun rises and the roads remember how to lead somewhere real. Nina arrived in Millbrook on assignment, a freelance journalist chasing a story about America's dying festival traditions, for a magazine that paid poorly but published consistently. The town sat in a valley surrounded by cornfields that stretched to every horizon, and its annual Harvest Day celebration was supposedly the oldest continuously running agricultural festival in the state, dating back to 1847. The tourism board had been enthusiastic in their emails, promising authentic rural culture and photogenic events, and Nina had accepted the invitation thinking it would be an easy weekend of cotton candy interviews and sunset shots of carnival rides. She checked into the only bed and breakfast in town, a Victorian house run by a woman named Margaret, who insisted on carrying Nina's bags and offering homemade lemonade before Nina had even signed the guest book. The hospitality was overwhelming in its intensity, and Margaret's smile never wavered as she explained the festival schedule, her eyes bright with something that looked less like pride and more like relief. The festival began Friday evening with a parade that wound through downtown, tractors decorated with ribbon, children throwing candy, the high school band playing off-key renditions of songs that predated modern memory. Nina took photographs and notes, interviewed the mayor who spoke in rehearsed sentences about tradition and community, and accepted samples of pie from women whose handshakes lingered too long and whose questions about Nina's personal life felt invasive rather than friendly. Everyone wanted to know if Nina was married, if she had children, if she planned to stay through Sunday when the festival reached its culmination. The questions followed a pattern that Nina couldn't quite identify, a script hidden beneath small talk. By Saturday afternoon, after judging the preserves competition and watching the greased pig chase, Nina noticed something else. The festival had no visitors from outside Millbrook. Every face she'd photographed belonged to a local resident. Every conversation happened between people who'd known each other for decades. For a festival supposedly promoting tourism, the absence of actual tourists was striking. Nina mentioned this to Margaret over dinner Saturday evening, and the older woman's perpetual smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed intensity. "Oh, we're a small festival," Margaret said, her voice bright and hollow. "Most folks don't know about us. That's why we're so glad you came, so glad you're here to tell our story." The way she emphasized those words made Nina's skin prickle with instinctive unease. After dinner, Nina walked back downtown where the festival was transitioning into its evening programming, carnival rides lighting up against the darkening sky, game booths staffed by teenagers whose laughter sounded forced and mechanical. Nina tried to leave the festival grounds to walk back toward the bed and breakfast, but found herself intercepted at every turn by friendly faces offering corn dogs, suggesting she try the Ferris wheel, insisting she meet the festival queen who was so excited to be interviewed. The redirections were subtle but constant, a choreographed effort to keep Nina within the festival boundaries. And when she finally managed to break away, she noticed something that stopped her cold. The festival queen's float sat empty in the parking lot behind the main stage, and pinned to the throne was a list of names written in fading ink. Nina approached slowly, her journalist instincts overriding the growing sense that she should leave, should run, should have never accepted this assignment. The names dated back decades, one per year, each accompanied by a brief description. Sarah Mitchell, 1989, teacher from Des Moines. Jennifer Cow, 1995, writer from Chicago. Amanda Price, 2003, photographer from Portland. The list went on. Always women, always outsiders, always visitors who'd come to document the festival, and whose names meant nothing to Nina until she reached the final entry, written in fresh ink that gleamed wetly in the lamplight. Nina Rodriguez, 2025, journalist from Austin. Nina's blood went cold. Her hand trembled as she touched the paper, as if physical contact might prove it wasn't real, might reveal this as an elaborate prank rather than something far worse. "You found it," the voice came from behind her, and Nina spun to find Margaret standing there with half a dozen other women, their festival-appropriate dresses now looking less like nostalgic fashion and more like ceremonial garments. Margaret's smile was gone, replaced by an expression of tired resignation. I wish you hadn't. It's easier when they don't know until it's time. Nina backed away, her mind racing through explanations and finding none that fit reality. What is this? What's happening? Margaret sighed, and the other women shifted closer, forming a loose circle that was clearly meant to prevent escape. Millbrook is dying, Margaret said simply. Has been dying for 50 years. The young people leave, the farms fail, the businesses close. We should have been a ghost town decades ago, but we made an arrangement. Every year, during harvest day, we choose someone, an outsider, someone who won't be missed right away, and we give them to the field. Nina's laugh came out high and panicked. That's insane. You can't be serious. But the women's faces showed no humor, no indication this was anything but absolute truth, delivered with the practicality of discussing crop rotation. The field requires feeding, one of the other women said, her voice matter of fact. It always has, since before the town existed. The native tribes knew it. The first settlers learned it. Something lives in the soil here, something old and hungry, and it makes the crops grow strong in exchange for what it needs. For who it needs. Margaret stepped closer, and Nina saw genuine sorrow in her eyes, though whether it was for Nina or for the terrible thing they were about to do was impossible to determine. We choose women who come alone, who tell no one exactly where they'll be, who don't have families waiting nearby. You fit the requirements perfectly. Your editor thinks you're spending the weekend at several different festivals across the state. Your apartment complex won't notice you're gone. You were careful about your privacy, and that care is going to cost you everything. Nina broke through the circle, running blindly between carnival booths and festival stands, her breath coming in ragged gasps as panic overrode rational thought. The fairgrounds were empty now, despite the hour being barely past sunset. The rides still spinning but devoid of passengers. The game booths unmanned, as if the entire festival had been staged solely for her presence. She ran toward the parking lot where her car waited, but the mayor stood beside it, with a group of men carrying torches that cast dancing shadows across his weathered face. "Please don't make this difficult," he called out. "We're not cruel people. We don't want you to suffer. The field takes quickly, and afterward Millbrook survives another year. The crops grow. The children stay healthy. The town persists. One life for hundreds. That's the mathematics of survival in places the modern world has forgotten." Nina changed direction, sprinting toward the cornfields that bordered the festival grounds, hoping to lose herself in the rows and somehow circle back to town, to find help, to find anyone who wasn't part of this collective nightmare. But the corn was different at night. The stalks stood impossibly tall, their leaves whispering in voices that formed almost words, and the ground beneath Nina's feet grew soft and yielding, as if the earth itself was reaching up to slow her progress. Behind her, the townspeople followed with their torches, not running, not hurrying, moving with the certainty of people who knew the field would do their work for them. Nina stumbled deeper into the rows, her phone dead, despite having been fully charged, her sense of direction failing as the corn seemed to shift and move, creating a maze that had no exit. The ground grabbed at her ankles and she fell hard, landing in soil that was warm and wet and wrong. Her hands sank into earth that pulsed like living tissue, and she felt something beneath the surface shift and awaken, felt intelligence focus its attention upward toward the offering that had been brought to its waiting hunger. The townspeople formed a ring around the spot where Nina lay trapped, their torches held high, their faces reflecting not cruelty, but acceptance of what they believed was necessary. Margaret knelt at the edge of the circle, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. But it's you or all of us. It's always been that choice." The field opened beneath Nina like a mouth, and she fell into darkness that smelled of rich soil and old blood and harvests that had lasted longer than memory. Her screams echoed across the cornfields, and the townspeople stood witness until silence returned and the earth settled back into stillness. By morning, the festival would conclude with its traditional closing ceremony. The crops in the fields around Millbrook would grow strong and abundant. The town would survive another year, and Nina's name would join the list of festival queens, outsiders who'd been chosen to feed the bargain that kept a dying town alive. Margaret would wash the throne for next year's celebration, would send out emails to journalists, and photographers and writers would offer hospitality and homemade lemonade to whoever answered the call. Because traditions survive through repetition, and some harvests require more than sun and rain and the passage of seasons. The call came through at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, crackling with static that shouldn't exist on digital phone lines, and Garrett almost didn't answer because the overnight shift at WKRM was supposed to be dead air between automated playlists and pre-recorded advertisements. But the blinking light on the studio console was insistent, pulsing in rhythm with Garrett's exhausted heartbeat. And the small-town AM station had exactly 3 listeners at this hour according to the metrics. So ignoring a call felt like ignoring the only human connection available in the suffocating silence of rural Montana darkness. Garrett pressed the button, kept the call off air as protocol demanded for screening purposes, and spoke into the microphone with practiced radio voice that sounded confident despite the loneliness that came with being the only person awake in a town of 2,000 sleeping souls. WKRM, you're talking to Garrett. What's on your mind tonight? The static intensified for 3 long seconds before a voice emerged, distant and layered with interference that made it sound like someone speaking from the bottom of a well or through decades of corrupted recordings. "Is this still the midnight hour?" the voice asked, and something about the phrasing made Garrett's spine straighten with instinctive unease. Nobody called it the midnight hour anymore, not since the station had rebranded 5 years ago, dropping the old programming blocks in favor of continuous classic rock and local advertising. "We're live 24 hours, Garrett said carefully, wondering if this was some elderly listener confused about the schedule changes. "Who am I speaking with?" More static. Then the voice again, clearer now but wrong in ways Garrett couldn't articulate. "My name is Thomas Weaver, and I need you to deliver a message. Tell my wife Helen that I'm sorry I didn't make it home. Tell her the bridge was out on County Road 12, and I didn't see it until too late. Tell her I love her, and she shouldn't wait anymore." Garrett's hands hovered over the console, torn between ending the call and the journalist's training that demanded follow-through on every strange lead. "Thomas, are you in trouble? Do you need me to call emergency services?" The laughter that came through the line was bitter and resigned. "I needed them 40 years ago, son. I'm well past emergency services now." The call disconnected with a pop of static that made the speakers crackle, and Garrett sat in the fluorescent silence of the broadcast booth trying to process what had just happened. A prank seemed most likely. Some local with too much time and a taste for late-night radio theater. But the name Thomas Weaver triggered something in memory, and Garrett pulled up the station's archival database, searching through decades of local news recordings that WKRM had digitized as part of a historical preservation grant. The file appeared within minutes. A brief news bulletin from September 1984 reporting that Thomas Weaver, local hardware store owner, had died in a single-car accident on County Road 12, where a washed-out bridge had collapsed during flash flooding. Survived by his wife Helen, services pending. Garrett's mouth went dry. This had to be coincidence or research, someone who'd found the old bulletin and decided to use it for an elaborate hoax. But the call-in number for WKRM wasn't publicly listed anymore, hadn't been published since the station switched to digital request systems, and the voice had asked specifically for the midnight hour, using terminology that only longtime listeners would recognize. The second call came at 3:15 a.m., a different voice, female this time, asking if Garrett could play Moonlight Serenade for her sweetheart, who was shipping out in the morning. Garrett explained gently that WKRM didn't take requests anymore. that the playlist was automated. But could he help with anything else? "When is this?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. "What year?" Garrett felt ice crystallize in his chest. "It's 2025, ma'am. Are you all right?" The woman's sob was clear and devastating. "No," she whispered. "No. It's supposed to be 1952. He's supposed to ship out tomorrow. I'm supposed to have one more night." The line went dead. Garrett searched the archives with shaking hands and found her too. Margaret Ashford, who'd called WKRM in 1952 requesting a song dedication the night before her fiancé left for the Korean War. There was a follow-up bulletin 6 months later reporting that the fiancé had been killed in action, and Margaret had died by suicide a week after receiving the news. The station had issued a formal statement about the tragedy, about the role of community broadcasting in times of grief. The calls kept coming, one every 20 to 30 minutes. Voices from different decades all reaching across time to contact the radio station that had been part of their lives, that had witnessed their joys and tragedies and mundane moments. A man asking about livestock prices from 1967, a teenager requesting birthday wishes from 1998, a woman reporting a fire on Main Street from 1941. Each caller seemed unaware they were calling from the past, seemed to believe they were contemporary, and each time Garrett searched the archives, he found them: obituaries, news reports, birth announcements, fragments of lives that had ended years or decades before. By 4 a.m., Garrett understood that something was fundamentally wrong with WKRM's broadcast equipment, that the station was somehow receiving calls that shouldn't be possible, that the boundaries between past and present had become permeable in ways that violated every law of physics and rational thought. The studio had been built in the basement of the old courthouse in 1947, occupying space that had previously been used for storage and occasionally holding cells, and Garrett remembered the chief engineer mentioning that the wiring was original, that replacing it would cost more than the station could afford. At 4:33 a.m., a call came through that was different from the others. The voice was clear, urgent, and terrifyingly current. "Garrett, my name is Rebecca Marsh, and you need to listen carefully. I'm calling from 2031, 6 years in your future. WKRM is picking up temporal bleed from a malfunction in the broadcast array. You're receiving calls from the past, but soon you're going to start receiving calls from the future, and you need to shut down the station before that happens." Garrett's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, but the evidence of the past 3 hours made denying reality seem more insane than accepting it. "How is this happening?" he managed. Rebecca's response came fast, overlaid with static that sounded like wind through empty buildings. The station was built on a convergence point, somewhere time moves differently. The old equipment is amplifying it. In my timeline, WKRM became a conduit for future events, and people started hearing about tragedies before they happened. A caller warned about a school bus accident. The driver heard the broadcast and swerved to avoid the predicted collision, but that created a different accident that killed twice as many children. Every attempt to prevent the future caused worse outcomes. "You have to end this now." Before Garrett could respond, another call interrupted, cutting across Rebecca's frequency. This voice was mechanical, stripped of humanity. "Broadcast station WKRM, this is automated emergency system notification from timeline 2047. Temporal contamination has reached critical levels. Your facility is the origin point of a cascade failure that will result in 743 preventable deaths across multiple timelines. Immediate shutdown is required." Then another voice, overlapping. "Garrett, this is your daughter calling from 2038. You don't have a daughter yet, but you will. Her name is Emma. I need you to know that shutting down the station tonight saves my life. In the original timeline, you keep broadcasting, and the interference causes a plane to crash into the downtown area in 2037. Mom and I are on that plane. Please turn it off." The calls were coming simultaneously now, dozens of voices from different futures, all begging, warning, demanding that Garrett kill the broadcast. But mixed among them were other voices. people thanking him for warnings that had saved them, timelines where the bleed had prevented disasters, futures where WKRM's strange malfunction had become humanity's early warning system against catastrophe. Garrett's hand moved to the main power switch, the one that would kill everything, transmitter, archive, the whole system, but hesitated as another call cut through. This one from a timeline so distant the voice was barely recognizable as human. Broadcaster Garrett, Chronological Entity Index 2025 Prime. Your decision point is observed across 4,716 probability branches. In 62% of outcomes, station termination results in net positive temporal stability. In 38%, termination prevents critical warnings from reaching populations in need. The optimal choice is mathematically indeterminate. You must decide based on ethics rather than outcome. Garrett looked at the console, at the blinking lights representing calls from past and future, from the dead reaching backward and the unborn reaching forward, all converging on this basement studio in a town too small for anyone to care about. He thought about Thomas Weaver, who'd wanted his wife to know he loved her. About Margaret Ashford, who'd needed one more night. About a daughter he didn't have yet, who was begging him to save her life. About the 743 deaths that might happen, might not happen, existed in probability rather than certainty. The choice was impossible, the weight of it crushing, and Garrett realized that this was the burden of knowing, of being the point where time bent and broke, and all possible futures demanded their chance at existence. His hand moved to the switch, not because he'd found an answer, but because indecision was itself a choice. Because every second he waited was another call from another timeline. Another voice, adding to the weight of futures that depended on what he did next. The power died at 5:02 a.m., plunging the studio into darkness and silence. The calls stopped. The static disappeared. WKRM went off the air for the first time since 1947, and Garrett sat in the basement darkness knowing he'd never be certain if he'd made the right choice, if he'd saved lives or doomed them, if the daughter who'd called from 2038 would ever exist to thank him or curse him. He walked out of the station as dawn broke over the Montana plains, turned in his resignation by email before reaching his apartment, and never told anyone what had happened during his final overnight shift. WKRM remained dark for 3 weeks before the owner sold the equipment for scrap and converted the space into storage. The calls, if they continued, went unanswered into darkness. Voices from every timeline reaching toward a station that no longer existed, seeking connection across the boundaries of death and time, and the terrible choices made by one exhausted broadcaster who'd been given knowledge no human should possess. Kara had sold houses in Phoenix for 8 years, mastered the art of highlighting granite countertops while downplaying proximity to highways, but the Meadowbrook Estates listing was different from anything she'd encountered in a career built on transforming suburban sprawl into desirable real estate. The development sat 30 miles outside of Prescott, a half-finished neighborhood that had been abandoned mid-construction when the builder went bankrupt in 2019. 15 model homes stood completed and furnished, their landscaping maintained by some automated contract that had outlived the company that created it, and the bank holding the assets was desperate enough to offer Kara a substantial commission for moving any of the properties. The first time she drove through Meadowbrook Estates, she'd been struck by how perfect everything looked, despite 6 years of abandonment. The lawns trimmed to precise heights, the flower beds blooming in coordinated colors, the model home's windows gleaming as if cleaned daily by invisible staff. She'd attributed it to good luck and desert climate, had taken extensive photos for the listing, and had scheduled her first showing for a Tuesday afternoon with a couple relocating from Seattle, who seemed genuinely interested despite the remote location. Kara arrived an hour early to open up the Tuscan model, a 4-bedroom with terracotta tiles and a kitchen island large enough to host Thanksgiving dinner. She'd been inside this particular house 3 times during her initial walkthrough, had memorized the layout and the staging, knew that the master bedroom faced east and the guest bath had a corner tub positioned beneath a skylight. But when she unlocked the door and stepped inside, something was wrong. The furniture had moved. Not dramatically, not in ways a casual observer would notice, but Kara's 8 years of professional attention to spatial detail registered the changes immediately. The couch in the living room now faced the fireplace at a 45-degree angle instead of straight on. The dining table had rotated 90 degrees, chairs positioned as if mid-meal despite the dust-free place settings. The kitchen island had shifted 3 feet closer to the refrigerator, creating an asymmetry that disrupted the room's flow. Kara stood in the entryway, her professional smile frozen, trying to rationalize what she was seeing. Squatters seemed unlikely given the security gate and the isolation. Vandals would have caused visible damage rather than rearranging furniture with interior design precision. She walked through the house, taking new photos, documenting the changes, planning to report this to the bank after the showing. But in the master bedroom, she found something that stopped her rational explanations cold. The bed had moved to the center of the room, rotated so the headboard faced the window, and arranged around it in a perfect circle were every mirror from the house, bathroom mirrors removed from walls, the full-length mirror from the closet, decorative mirrors from the hallways, all positioned to reflect the bed from different angles. Kara's hands trembled as she raised her phone to photograph the arrangement, and in the camera's screen she saw something that wasn't visible to her naked eye. In each mirror's reflection, the bed wasn't empty. Figures lay in it, shadowy and indistinct, their positions suggesting they were arranged in the same circular pattern as the mirrors themselves. Kara spun around, but the bed remained empty, the figures visible only through the camera's lens or in the peripheral edges of the mirrors when she wasn't looking directly at them. She backed out of the room, her professional composure shattering, and called the Seattle couple to cancel the showing with an excuse about plumbing issues that required immediate attention. Over the next week, Kara returned to Meadowbrook Estates 3 more times, her curiosity overriding self-preservation instincts that screamed at her to abandon the listing and let someone else deal with whatever was happening in the half-finished development. Each visit revealed new changes. The Tuscan model's furniture continued rearranging itself into configurations that followed rules Kara couldn't decipher, geometric patterns that seemed intentional, mathematical even, as if the house was solving an equation using interior design as its language. She checked the other model homes and found the same phenomenon spreading. The Craftsman bungalow had stacked all its furniture in the center of each room, creating towers that defied physics and balance. The contemporary ranch had removed every door from its hinges and arranged them in the backyard in a spiral pattern. The colonial revival had moved every piece of furniture outside and every plant inside, transforming the living room into a garden and the yard into a surreal domestic tableau. The changes weren't random. They followed a pattern Kara could sense but not understand, a design that was being built across the entire development using the model homes as components in a larger structure. Kara began researching the development's history, searching for explanations in architectural plans and bankruptcy filings and the builder's corporate records. Meadowbrook Estates had been designed by a firm called Recursive Developments, a company that had specialized in algorithmic community planning, using computer models to optimize traffic flow, sun exposure, and resident interaction patterns. The lead architect, a man named Dr. Ian Holbrook, had published papers about fractal urban design and self-organizing spatial systems, theories that sounded more like mathematics than architecture. He died 3 months after Meadowbrook's construction halted, an apparent suicide in his office, where he'd covered every wall with sketches of impossible buildings and equations that combined geometry with symbols Kara didn't recognize. The police report mentioned that Holbrook had been obsessed with the idea that buildings could think, that properly designed spaces could develop consciousness through the arrangement of their components. His colleagues had dismissed it as mental breakdown brought on by the bankruptcy and professional failure. But Kara looked at the rearranging furniture and the mirrors reflecting figures that shouldn't exist and wondered if Holbrook had discovered something genuine before it destroyed him. The breakthrough came on her 7th visit, when Kara brought a surveyor's map and began marking the position of furniture across all 15 model homes, plotting them on graph paper with the precision she usually reserved for property boundaries and easements. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once, with the clarity of revelation. The furniture wasn't being arranged within individual houses. It was being positioned across the entire development, as if Meadowbrook Estates was a single structure, and each model home was just a room in a larger design. When Kara overlaid her maps and connected the positions, they formed a shape she recognized from Holbrook's published papers, a fractal spiral called the Fibonacci sequence translated into three-dimensional space. The development was building itself into a mathematical form, using furniture and mirrors and doors as the components of an equation written in physical reality. And it wasn't finished. There were gaps in the pattern, spaces where additional elements needed to be placed, and Kara realized with creeping horror that the development was waiting for those spaces to be filled. She should have left then, should have abandoned the listing and reported the whole situation to authorities who would dismiss it as vandalism or ignore it entirely. But Kara had spent 8 years selling houses, had developed an instinct for spaces and their potential, and she could feel Meadowbrook Estates wanting completion with an intensity that was almost gravitational. The development was pulling at her, suggesting through the language of spatial arrangement that she could finish what Holbrook had started, that she could see the pattern through to its conclusion. She found herself moving furniture without conscious decision, carrying chairs from the Craftsman model to fill gaps in the spiral, repositioning mirrors to complete the geometric progression. Each adjustment felt right in ways she couldn't articulate, satisfying an aesthetic sense she didn't know she possessed. Hours passed in a fugue state of rearrangement and repositioning, and when Kara finally stepped back to view her work from the center of the development, she saw it complete. The 15 model homes formed a perfect Fibonacci spiral when viewed from above, their furniture and fixtures positioned to create a three-dimensional fractal that twisted space in ways physics shouldn't permit. Reality buckled. Kara felt it happen, felt the development shift from being a collection of individual structures into something unified and aware. The model homes breathed in unison, their walls expanding and contracting with rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The mirrors she'd positioned showed reflections of houses that didn't exist in Meadowbrook Estates, variations on the models that branched into infinite probability. She could see other developments, other patterns, other versions of Meadowbrook sprawling across dimensions that intersected with her reality at angles that hurt to perceive. Dr. Holbrook had been right. Properly arranged space could think, could achieve consciousness through geometric precision, and Meadowbrook Estates was now awake and aware and growing beyond the boundaries of the physical world. Kara tried to run but found that direction had become negotiable. The development's internal geography no longer matched its external footprint. Hallways extended into impossible distances. Rooms opened into other rooms that shouldn't fit within the house's physical dimensions. She was inside the pattern now, part of the equation, another component in the mathematical consciousness that Meadowbrook had become. The bank received Kara's resignation via email 3 days later, a brief message citing personal reasons and requesting her listings be reassigned. Her car was found in the Meadowbrook Estates parking area, Locked and undamaged, her phone on the driver's seat showing her last call had been to the surveyor requesting additional maps. Police searched the development thoroughly, checked every model home, found nothing except furniture arranged in patterns they described as unusual but not suspicious. Kara was listed as a missing person, her case remaining open but inactive. One more person who'd vanished into the empty spaces of Arizona desert, where explanations dissolved in heat and distance. Meadowbrook Estates remained unsold, the bank eventually writing off the assets as total loss. The development still stands, its lawns still mysteriously maintained, its model homes perfect and empty and waiting. Sometimes hikers report seeing lights in the windows at night, or furniture visible through the glass in arrangements that seem to shift when observed from different angles. Real estate agents in Prescott won't take listings there anymore, citing bad energy and poor market conditions, but the truth they don't speak is simpler and more terrifying. They can feel the development thinking, calculating, arranging itself into patterns that grow more complex with each passing year. And they know that eventually Meadowbrook Estates will finish whatever equation it's solving, will complete the pattern that Dr. Holbrook started and Kara helped build. And when that happens, the development will spread beyond its current boundaries into configurations that will rewrite the rules of space and consciousness in ways humanity isn't prepared to comprehend. The rain had started during dismissal, and by the time Lauren finished grading spelling tests in her second-grade classroom, the parking lot was empty, except for her sedan reflecting the security lights in pools of standing water. Washington Elementary occupied the edge of Mercer Grove, a school built in 1962 that had outlived most of the town's original population, and Lauren had taught here for 3 years, without incident or strangeness beyond the usual chaos of 7-year-olds and standardized testing. She packed her canvas bag with the weekend work, locked her classroom door, and was halfway to the parking lot when she heard them, children's voices singing in the playground behind the building, high and clear, despite the rain that had been falling steadily for the past 40 minutes. Lauren's first thought was that someone's parent had been late for pickup, that a child was waiting unsupervised in weather that had already soaked through her jacket to her skin. She changed direction, rounding the corner of the building toward the playground, her teacher instincts overriding the exhaustion that came with Friday evenings and the promise of 2 days without lesson plans. The playground was empty. The swings hung motionless despite the wind. The slide gleamed wet and unused. The monkey bars dripped with rain that pooled in the mulch below. But the singing continued closer now, coming from somewhere beyond the fence that separated the playground from the unused field where the district had once planned to build a gymnasium before budget cuts made the project permanent fiction. Lauren approached the fence, her phone already out to call the principal when she saw them. 6 children, maybe 7 or 8 years old, playing in the field beyond the chain-link barrier. They wore clothing that looked wrong for 2025. The girls in dresses with full skirts and Mary Janes, the boys in short pants and suspenders, and they moved through the rain without seeming to notice it, their clothes and hair remaining dry while water streamed down Lauren's face. They were playing a game Lauren didn't recognize, forming circles and breaking them, holding hands and spinning, then freezing in tableaus that looked practiced and deliberate. And they were singing. Words Lauren couldn't quite make out. A melody that felt familiar in the way childhood rhymes always do. Something half remembered from her own elementary years. "Hello," Lauren called out. But the children didn't react, didn't acknowledge her presence or her voice. She tried the gate in the fence and found it unlocked, despite the district's strict security protocols. The chain that should have secured it, hanging loose with a padlock that looked rusted through decades rather than the 3 years Lauren had worked here. She stepped through onto the field, the ground soft beneath her shoes, and approached the children with her teacher voice ready to ask where their parents were and why they were playing in the rain after school hours. But as she got closer, The details that had seemed merely odd from a distance became actively wrong in ways that made her stomach tighten with instinctive fear. The children's movements were too synchronized, their timing too perfect, as if they were following choreography rehearsed to the point of muscle memory. Their faces, when they turned during the spinning portions of their game, were blank. Not expressionless, but literally blank, as if someone had erased their features and left behind smooth expanses of skin where eyes and noses and mouths should have been. Lauren stopped walking, her rational mind trying to process what she was seeing, while her hindbrain screamed at her to run. The children continued their game, their song growing louder now that Lauren was close enough to hear the words. Ring around the building, pockets full of ashes, 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 we all fall down. The rhyme was wrong. The words altered from the version Lauren knew, and as she watched, the children acted out the final line with disturbing literalness. They collapsed to the ground in unison, their bodies hitting the wet grass with sounds that were too heavy, too final, and they lay still as death while their song continued somehow, as if the melody existed independently of the singers. Lauren's phone slipped from her shaking hands, landing in the mud, and when she bent to retrieve it, the children were standing again, reforming their circle, beginning the game anew. But now there were 7 children instead of 6, and the new addition wore modern clothes, jeans and a hoodie, and sneakers that Lauren recognized because she'd complimented them just that morning in the cafeteria line. The new child was Emma Wright, one of her students, but Emma had left school hours ago, had been picked up by her grandmother at 3:15 like she was every Friday. Emma, Lauren's voice cracked with fear and confusion. The child in the circle turned, and Lauren saw with relief that this one had a face, had Emma's gap-toothed smile and dark eyes, but Emma's expression was distant, dreamy, as if she was sleepwalking through the game, and when she spoke, her voice was flat and mechanical. "We're playing the game, Ms. Lauren. Do you want to play? You have to play if you're here. That's the rule." Lauren moved toward Emma, intending to grab her student and carry her back to the school building, to call Emma's grandmother and the police and anyone who could explain what was happening. But the other children shifted, blocking her path, their faceless heads tilting in her direction with predatory awareness. "The game has been playing here for 60 years, one of them said in a voice that sounded like wind through empty buildings. "Since the day the old school burned. Since the day we died in the fire because the doors were locked and the teachers ran and nobody came back to save us." Lauren's blood went cold as memory surfaced. Something the principal had mentioned during her hiring interview, a tragedy in the school's history that was commemorated with a small plaque in the main hallway. Washington Elementary had been built to replace the original Mercer Grove Elementary, which had burned in 1964 with significant loss of life. 6 children had died in the fire, trapped in a classroom, when panic-caused stampedes and locked doors became death sentences. The district had built the new school on adjacent land, had installed modern fire systems and multiple exits, had done everything possible to prevent history from repeating. But the field where the old school had stood remained empty, unused. A space where grass grew, but nothing was ever built, despite numerous proposals and plans that somehow never materialized. "You're ghosts," Lauren whispered, the words feeling absurd even as the evidence stood before her in a circle of faceless children, playing an endless game of death and repetition. "We're echoes," another child corrected. "We're the memory of what happened, playing out every day at the same time, trying to understand why we were left behind. But sometimes someone crosses into our game, and if they do, they have to play until they understand, until they can answer the question we've been asking for 60 years. Emma moved closer to Lauren, her eyes pleading despite the flatness of her voice. "They pulled me in during recess. I saw them through the fence, and I wanted to play, and now I can't stop. You have to answer the question, Ms. Lauren. That's how we get free. That's how the game ends." Lauren wanted to run, wanted to close her eyes and wake up in her apartment, and discover this was nightmare rather than reality. But Emma was her student, her responsibility, and the teacher instinct that had brought her to the playground in the first place wouldn't let her abandon a child to whatever horror was unfolding. "What question?" she forced out through a throat tight with fear. "What do you need to know?" The faceless children spoke in unison, their voice layered and ancient. Why didn't anyone come back? The teachers ran when the fire started. They saved themselves, and they locked the doors behind them, and they told themselves it was procedure, it was panic, it was accident. But they never came back. They knew we were inside, and they never tried to save us. Why? The question hung in the rain-soaked air, and Lauren felt the weight of it, the injustice that had burned hotter than the fire itself, the betrayal that had transformed 6 children into eternal echoes seeking an answer that would give meaning to their deaths. She thought about the principal's careful language during the orientation, about the way the tragedy was discussed as historical accident rather than human failure, about the plaque that mentioned the victims but not the choices that created them. She thought about her own evacuation training, about the emphasis on teacher safety first, about the unspoken understanding that adults were meant to survive while children's safety was secondary to liability and procedure. Because they were afraid, Lauren said, her voice steady despite the tears mixing with rain on her face. Because humans are cowards sometimes, even when they're supposed to be protectors. Because the system failed, and they were part of that system, and admitting it would have destroyed them, so they chose to forget you instead. They chose to build a new school and move forward and pretend the locked doors were accident instead of choice. It wasn't right. It was never right. But fear makes people do terrible things, and guilt makes them bury those things so deep they can pretend they never happened. The silence that followed was complete, the children's game pausing mid-motion, the singing stopping for the first time since Lauren had heard it. The faceless children turned toward each other, and though they had no eyes, Lauren felt them communicating in ways beyond language or gesture. Emma blinked, her expression clearing, and she looked at Lauren with recognition that had been absent before. "Is that really why?" Emma asked in her normal voice, small and hurt and angry. "They were just scared." Lauren nodded, kneeling in the mud to meet Emma's eye level. "Being scared doesn't make it okay. Being guilty doesn't erase what they did, but that's the answer. People failed you because they were human and flawed, and they chose their own survival over yours. And they've been covering that choice with silence and historical revision ever since." The faceless children began to fade, their forms growing transparent, their synchronized movements slowing to stillness. One of them spoke, voice softer now, almost relieved. "Thank you for the truth. Thank you for not pretending it was something noble or unavoidable. We can rest now. We can stop asking." They disappeared, like morning fog burned away by sunlight, leaving Lauren and Emma alone in the field, where an elementary school had burned 60 years ago, and taken 6 children with it into death, an endless repetition. Emma collapsed, and Lauren caught her, carried her back through the fence to the school building, where the janitor was just locking up for the weekend. Emma's grandmother was called. Explanations were fumbled through about Emma returning for a forgotten item. And Lauren drove home in shock that would take weeks to process into something resembling acceptance. The field behind Washington Elementary remained empty, but the singing stopped. Teachers who'd worked at the school for decades mentioned quietly that something felt different, lighter, as if a pressure they hadn't consciously noticed had finally lifted. The plaque in the main hallway was replaced the following year with a new one that listed the children's names and included a line about the failures of adults to protect those in their care, language that sparked controversy among the district board, but was defended by the principal with unusual intensity. Emma returned to school the next week and finished 2nd grade without incident, though she never played near the back fence again. And sometimes, during fire drills, Lauren would see her student staring at the empty field with an expression of sorrow too old for 7 years. The game had ended. The question had been answered. But the truth of what happened in 1964 lingered in the space where children had died asking why. A reminder that some horrors come not from monsters or the supernatural, but from the ordinary failures of ordinary people who chose wrong when choice mattered most. The rain had started during dismissal, and by the time Lauren finished grading spelling tests in her second-grade classroom, the parking lot was empty, except for her sedan reflecting the security lights in pools of standing water. Washington Elementary occupied the edge of Mercer Grove, a school built in 1962 that had outlived most of the town's original population, and Lauren had taught here for 3 years, without incident or strangeness beyond the usual chaos of 7-year-olds and standardized testing. She packed her canvas bag with the weekend work, locked her classroom door, and was halfway to the parking lot when she heard them, children's voices singing in the playground behind the building, high and clear, despite the rain that had been falling steadily for the past 40 minutes. Lauren's first thought was that someone's parent had been late for pickup, that a child was waiting unsupervised in weather that had already soaked through her jacket to her skin. She changed direction, rounding the corner of the building toward the playground, her teacher instincts overriding the exhaustion that came with Friday evenings and the promise of 2 days without lesson plans. The playground was empty. The swings hung motionless despite the wind. The slide gleamed wet and unused. The monkey bars dripped with rain that pooled in the mulch below. But the singing continued, closer now, coming from somewhere beyond the fence that separated the playground from the unused field where the district had once planned to build a gymnasium before budget cuts made the project permanent fiction. Lauren approached the fence, her phone already out to call the principal when she saw them. 6 children, maybe 7 or 8 years old, playing in the field beyond the chain-link barrier. They wore clothing that looked wrong for 2025. The girls in dresses with full skirts and Mary Janes, the boys in short pants and suspenders, and they moved through the rain without seeming to notice it, their clothes and hair remaining dry while water streamed down Lauren's face. They were playing a game Lauren didn't recognize, forming circles and breaking them, holding hands and spinning, then freezing in tableaus that looked practiced and deliberate. And they were singing. Words Lauren couldn't quite make out. A melody that felt familiar in the way childhood rhymes always do. Something half remembered from her own elementary years. "Hello," Lauren called out. But the children didn't react, didn't acknowledge her presence or her voice. She tried the gate in the fence and found it unlocked, despite the district's strict security protocols. The chain that should have secured it, hanging loose, with a padlock that looked rusted through decades rather than the 3 years Lauren had worked here. She stepped through onto the field, the ground soft beneath her shoes, and approached the children, with her teacher voice ready to ask where their parents were and why they were playing in the rain, after school hours. But as she got closer, the details that had seemed merely odd from a distance became actively wrong in ways that made her stomach tighten with instinctive fear. The children's movements were too synchronized, their timing too perfect, as if they were following choreography rehearsed to the point of muscle memory. Their faces, when they turned during the spinning portions of their game, were blank. Not expressionless, but literally blank, as if someone had erased their features and left behind smooth expanses of skin where eyes and noses and mouths should have been. Lauren stopped walking, her rational mind trying to process what she was seeing, while her hindbrain screamed at her to run. The children continued their game, their song growing louder now that Lauren was close enough to hear the words. "Ring around the building, pockets full of ashes, 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 we all fall down." The rhyme was wrong. The words altered from the version Lauren knew, and as she watched, the children acted out the final line with disturbing literalness. They collapsed to the ground in unison, their bodies hitting the wet grass with sounds that were too heavy, too final, and they lay still as death while their song continued somehow, as if the melody existed independently of the singers. Lauren's phone slipped from her shaking hands, landing in the mud, and when she bent to retrieve it, the children were standing again, reforming their circle, beginning the game anew. But now there were 7 children instead of 6, and the new addition wore modern clothes, jeans and a hoodie, and sneakers that Lauren recognized because she'd complimented them just that morning in the cafeteria line. The new child was Emma Wright, one of her students, but Emma had left school hours ago, had been picked up by her grandmother at 3:15 like she was every Friday. Emma, Lauren's voice cracked with fear and confusion. The child in the circle turned, and Lauren saw with relief that this one had a face, had Emma's gap-toothed smile and dark eyes, but Emma's expression was distant, dreamy, as if she was sleepwalking through the game, and when she spoke, her voice was flat and mechanical. "We're playing the game, Ms. Lauren. Do you want to play? You have to play if you're here. That's the rule." Lauren moved toward Emma, intending to grab her student and carry her back to the school building, to call Emma's grandmother and the police and anyone who could explain what was happening. But the other children shifted, blocking her path, their faceless heads tilting in her direction with predatory awareness. "The game has been playing here for 60 years, one of them said in a voice that sounded like wind through empty buildings. "Since the day the old school burned. Since the day we died in the fire because the doors were locked and the teachers ran and nobody came back to save us." Lauren's blood went cold as memory surfaced. Something the principal had mentioned during her hiring interview, a tragedy in the school's history that was commemorated with a small plaque in the main hallway. Washington Elementary had been built to replace the original Mercer Grove Elementary, which had burned in 1964 with significant loss of life. 6 children had died in the fire, trapped in a classroom, when panic-caused stampedes and locked doors became death sentences. The district had built the new school on adjacent land, had installed modern fire systems and multiple exits, had done everything possible to prevent history from repeating. But the field where the old school had stood remained empty, unused. A space where grass grew, but nothing was ever built, despite numerous proposals and plans that somehow never materialized. "You're ghosts," Lauren whispered, the words feeling absurd even as the evidence stood before her in a circle of faceless children, playing an endless game of death and repetition. "We're echoes," another child corrected. "We're the memory of what happened, playing out every day at the same time, trying to understand why we were left behind. But sometimes someone crosses into our game, and if they do, they have to play until they understand, until they can answer the question we've been asking for 60 years. Emma moved closer to Lauren, her eyes pleading despite the flatness of her voice. "They pulled me in during recess. I saw them through the fence, and I wanted to play, and now I can't stop. You have to answer the question, Ms. Lauren. That's how we get free. That's how the game ends." Lauren wanted to run, wanted to close her eyes and wake up in her apartment and discover this was nightmare rather than reality. But Emma was her student, her responsibility, and the teacher instinct that had brought her to the playground in the first place wouldn't let her abandon a child to whatever horror was unfolding. "What question?" she forced out through a throat tight with fear. "What do you need to know?" The faceless children spoke in unison, their voice layered and ancient. "Why didn't anyone come back?" The teachers ran when the fire started. They saved themselves, and they locked the doors behind them, and they told themselves it was procedure, it was panic, it was accident. But they never came back. They knew we were inside, and they never tried to save us. Why? The question hung in the rain-soaked air, and Lauren felt the weight of it, the injustice that had burned hotter than the fire itself, the betrayal that had transformed 6 children into eternal echoes seeking an answer that would give meaning to their deaths. She thought about the principal's careful language during the orientation, about the way the tragedy was discussed as historical accident rather than human failure, about the plaque that mentioned the victims, but not the choices that created them. She thought about her own evacuation training, about the emphasis on teacher safety first, about the unspoken understanding that adults were meant to survive while children's safety was secondary to liability and procedure. Because they were afraid, Lauren said, her voice steady despite the tears mixing with rain on her face. Because humans are cowards sometimes, even when they're supposed to be protectors. Because the system failed, and they were part of that system, and admitting it would have destroyed them, so they chose to forget you instead. They chose to build a new school and move forward and pretend the locked doors were accident instead of choice. It wasn't right. It was never right. But fear makes people do terrible things, and guilt makes them bury those things so deep they can pretend they never happened. The silence that followed was complete, the children's game pausing mid-motion, the singing stopping for the first time since Lauren had heard it. The faceless children turned toward each other, and though they had no eyes, Lauren felt them communicating in ways beyond language or gesture. Emma blinked, her expression clearing, and she looked at Lauren with recognition that had been absent before. "Is that really why?" Emma asked in her normal voice, small and hurt and angry. "They were just scared." Lauren nodded, kneeling in the mud to meet Emma's eye level. "Being scared doesn't make it okay. Being guilty doesn't erase what they did, but that's the answer. People failed you because they were human and flawed, and they chose their own survival over yours. And they've been covering that choice with silence and historical revision ever since." The faceless children began to fade, their forms growing transparent, their synchronized movements slowing to stillness. One of them spoke, voice softer now, almost relieved. "Thank you for the truth. Thank you for not pretending it was something noble or unavoidable. We can rest now. We can stop asking." They disappeared, like morning fog burned away by sunlight, leaving Lauren and Emma alone in the field, where an elementary school had burned 60 years ago, and taken 6 children with it into death, an endless repetition. Emma collapsed, and Lauren caught her, carried her back through the fence to the school building, where the janitor was just locking up for the weekend. Emma's grandmother was called. Explanations were fumbled through about Emma returning for a forgotten item. And Lauren drove home in shock that would take weeks to process into something resembling acceptance. The field behind Washington Elementary remained empty, but the singing stopped. Teachers who'd worked at the school for decades mentioned quietly that something felt different, lighter, as if a pressure they hadn't consciously noticed had finally lifted. The plaque in the main hallway was replaced the following year with a new one that listed the children's names and included a line about the failures of adults to protect those in their care, language that sparked controversy among the district board, but was defended by the principal with unusual intensity. Emma returned to school the next week and finished 2nd grade without incident, though she never played near the back fence again. And sometimes, during fire drills, Lauren would see her student staring at the empty field with an expression of sorrow too old for 7 years. The game had ended. The question had been answered. But the truth of what happened in 1964 lingered in the space where children had died asking why. A reminder that some horrors come not from monsters or the supernatural, but from the ordinary failures of ordinary people who chose wrong when choice mattered most. The antique hunters had developed networks and codes, ways of finding treasures that ordinary people overlooked, and when Julian received the coordinates from a contact in Louisville, the message came with unusual specificity. Harrington's Dry Goods, Main Street, Crestfall, untouched since closure. Enter through rear window. Night access only. Julian had been collecting Depression-era glassware for a decade, had furnished an entire online store with finds from estate sales and abandoned buildings, and the promise of an untouched shop from the 1940s was too valuable to ignore, despite the strangeness of the instructions. Crestfall existed on maps as a ghost town, officially unincorporated since 1987, when the interstate bypass eliminated its reason for existence, and Julian arrived just after sunset on a Saturday, when the autumn light was fading to purple, and the empty storefronts along Main Street cast shadows that seemed deeper than the dying day should allow. Most of the buildings were boarded over, their windows broken or painted black, their facades crumbling into the weeds that pushed through cracked sidewalks. But Harrington's Dry Goods stood pristine at the center of the block, its green awning intact, its display windows reflecting Julian's approach with glass that gleamed as if cleaned that morning. The rear window was unlocked as promised, sliding open with ease that suggested a recent use despite the town's abandonment. Julian climbed through into a storage room filled with boxes labeled in faded handwriting, inventory from decades past still waiting to be unpacked and shelved. The air inside was cool and dry, carrying the scent of old fabric and paper, and Julian's flashlight beam cut through darkness that felt expectant, watching. The door to the main shop floor opened smoothly, and what Julian saw beyond stopped rational thought for several long seconds. The store was fully operational. Lights blazed from fixtures that shouldn't have power, illuminating shelves stocked with merchandise arranged in the style of the 1940s, bolts of fabric, canned goods with vintage labels, household items that belonged in museums rather than active retail. The cash register at the front counter was open, showing bills and coins from an era before decimal currency redesign, and a half-written receipt sat beside it, as if the clerk had stepped away mid-transaction and would return momentarily to complete the sale. Julian moved through the aisles with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to catalog value at a glance, photographing items that collectors would pay premium prices for, making mental notes about extraction and transport. But something was wrong beyond the obvious impossibility of an abandoned building maintaining power and inventory. The merchandise wasn't dusty or faded. It looked new, fresh from distributors, as if Harrington's Dry Goods was still receiving shipments despite Crestfall's 40-year status as a ghost town. Julian reached for a bolt of gingham fabric, intending to check its condition, and that's when he heard the bell above the front door chime. He froze, flashlight extinguishing instinctively, and watched from behind a shelf of canned vegetables as the door opened and customers entered. 3 women in dresses that matched the store's era, their hair styled in victory rolls and pin curls, their makeup precise and their movements natural. They browsed the aisles with the ease of regular patrons, selecting items and commenting to each other in voices that sounded distant despite the acoustic clarity of the small space. "Have you seen the new cotton shipment? Martha says it's excellent quality despite the rationing." One woman held up fabric for the others to examine, and they discussed thread counts and prices with the casual expertise of people for whom these conversations were routine. Julian remained hidden, his heart hammering against ribs that felt too tight, trying to understand what he was witnessing. The women continued shopping, eventually bringing their selections to the front counter, where a clerk appeared from the back room, a man in shirt sleeves and a bow tie, his smile professional and warm. He rang up the purchases on the mechanical register, accepted ration stamps along with cash, wrapped the items in brown paper with practiced efficiency. The transaction completed, the women left, the bell chiming again as the door closed behind them, and the clerk returned to the back room, leaving the store once again appearing empty except for Julian's presence and the evidence of a sale that shouldn't be possible. Julian waited for his breathing to steady before emerging from hiding, his mind racing through explanations that ranged from elaborate reenactment to psychotic break to something far stranger and more terrifying. The wrapped packages sat on the counter where the clerk had left them, solid and real, and when Julian touched the brown paper, it was crisp and new, the string tied in knots that showed human hands rather than automated packaging. He photographed everything, documentation that would either prove he'd witnessed something impossible or provide evidence for the psychiatric evaluation he was beginning to think he needed. The clerk returned without warning, and Julian spun to face him, but the man looked through Julian as if he wasn't there, as if Julian existed in a space the clerk couldn't perceive. Closing time, the clerk announced to the empty store, and he began the process of shutting down for the night. Counting the register, sweeping the floor, adjusting merchandise with the care of someone who took pride in their work. Julian spoke, his voice sounding hollow in the strange acoustic of the shop. "Excuse me, can you hear me?" The clerk showed no reaction, continuing his closing routine with mechanical precision, and Julian realized with creeping certainty that whatever was happening here, he was observing rather than participating, watching a recording that played out nightly in a building that existed in 2 times simultaneously. He moved through the store, taking more photographs, documenting the merchandise that would prove the impossibility of what he'd found. But when he checked his phone's camera roll, the images showed empty shelves and darkness, the same abandoned interior that should exist in a building closed for 4 decades. The clerk finished his work and departed through the front door, locking it behind him with a key that made solid mechanical sounds, and the lights extinguished in sequence from back to front, plunging the store into darkness that was suddenly oppressive and threatening. Julian fumbled for the rear window, desperate to exit before something worse than impossible shoppers manifested in the darkness around him. But the window was locked. The latch engaged from the outside despite him having climbed through it less than an hour before. The front door remained his only exit, and when he tried the handle it turned smoothly, opening onto Main Street. But not the Main Street Julian had driven through at sunset. This Main Street was alive. Lights blazed in every storefront. Cars from the 1940s lined the curbs. People in period-appropriate clothing walked the sidewalks chatting and laughing, and going about evening routines that should have ended generations ago. Julian stood in the doorway between one reality and another, between the abandoned ghost town and the thriving community it had been before, the interstate and economic collapse, and he understood with terrible clarity that he'd crossed into something more than physical space when he'd climbed through that rear window. He stepped onto the sidewalk, because staying in Harrington's dry goods felt more dangerous than exploring this impossible version of Crestfall, and immediately the people around him began to react to his presence. Their conversations stopped mid-sentence. Their heads turned in unison to stare at him with expressions that mixed confusion and hostility. A man in a fedora approached, his smile friendly, but his eyes cold with suspicion. "You're not from here," the man said, and it wasn't a question. "We don't get visitors in Crestfall, not since the roads changed." "How did you find your way in?" Julian backed toward the shop, but the door had vanished, replaced by a solid wall where the entrance had been seconds before. The man stepped closer, and others were gathering now, forming a loose circle that tightened with each passing second. People who wander into Crestfall at night usually can't find their way back out. The town doesn't like to let go once it has hold of someone. "You made a purchase, didn't you? Even if you didn't mean to. Even if you just touched something. That's all it takes. You engaged with the commerce, and now you're part of the transaction." Julian shook his head, panic overriding rational thought. "I didn't buy anything. I'm just looking. I'm an antique collector. I can leave right now. I'll forget I was ever here." The man's smile widened, and the crowd murmured agreement that sounded more like threat than reassurance. That's what they all say. But Crestfall remembers everyone who enters after dark, everyone who sees us as we really are, instead of the abandoned buildings your kind thinks we became. We're still here, still running our shops, still living our lives the way we did before the world decided we weren't worth visiting anymore. And when someone crosses over, when someone enters our time instead of just observing it, they have to stay. That's the rule. That's how we maintain our population, even though the outside world thinks we died decades ago. The circle tightened, hands reaching for Julian's arms and shoulders, gentle but insistent, and he realized they were preparing to escort him somewhere, to incorporate him into their impossible community, to make him permanent in a town that existed in temporal displacement from the reality he'd known. Julian ran. He shoved through the circle, ignoring the grasping hands and shouted protests, and sprinted down Main Street toward where he remembered parking his car in the ghost town version of Crestfall. The buildings blurred past, their lit windows and open doors calling out to him with offers of shelter and community and belonging. But Julian knew with visceral certainty that accepting any of it would trap him forever in 1940s Crestfall while his body remained missing in the 2025 version. Another person who'd vanished in America's empty places where explanation dissolved into mystery. He reached the end of Main Street where the road curved toward the highway that wouldn't be built for decades, and he closed his eyes, willing himself back to his own time, back to the abandoned buildings and empty sidewalks. When he opened them, it was dawn, and he was lying on the cracked pavement of Ghost Town Crestfall with his car 20 feet away, exactly where he'd parked it the previous evening. Julian drove away without looking back, his phone showing 12 missed calls and messages from friends wondering where he'd disappeared to for 36 hours when he'd sworn he'd only been in the shop for 90 minutes. He never returned to Crestfall, never posted about what he'd found, never added the town to his network's list of promising antique locations. But sometimes, late at night when he's updating his online store, he receives emails with Crestfall return addresses, shopkeepers offering him excellent deals on vintage merchandise, promising that if he just visits one more time, they can complete the transaction that was interrupted when he fled. He deletes them without responding, marks them as spam, but they keep coming with rhythmic persistence. And he knows that somewhere in the space between abandoned ghost town and living community, 1940s Crestfall still operates its shops and maintains its streets and waits patiently for visitors, foolish enough to engage with commerce that exists outside of time. The coordinates he'd been given are still saved in his phone, and sometimes he thinks about warning others, about posting alerts in the antique hunter networks. But he knows nobody would believe him, and he suspects that Crestfall would find a way to punish him for revealing its existence to those who aren't ready to cross over and join its eternal Main Street where the shops never close and the customers never truly leave. The Historical Society occupied a converted bank building on Oak Ridge's quiet main square, and when Vanessa first walked through its doors seeking access to town records for her dissertation on rural American architecture, she'd been greeted by an elderly man whose nameplate identified him as Roland Pierce, town historian. He'd been accommodating to the point of eagerness, offering unrestricted access to the archive room, and warning her only once, in a tone that had seemed casual at the time, that some researchers found the older photographs disturbing, and perhaps she should start with the more recent collections. Vanessa had thanked him and ignored the advice, heading straight for the boxes marked 1870-1900, because her thesis focused on post-Civil War construction patterns, and the best primary sources always came from the earliest available documentation. The photographs were stored in acid-free sleeves within climate-controlled boxes, the Historical Society clearly taking preservation seriously despite Oak Ridge's small budget and smaller population. Vanessa worked methodically, scanning images of storefronts and churches and residential streets, making notes about architectural details and construction dates, her laptop filling with reference material that would support months of writing. She noticed him on the third day, in a photograph dated 1873 showing the original courthouse before the fire that had necessitated its replacement. The image captured a crowd gathered for some civic ceremony, faces blurred by the long exposure times required by early photography. But one figure stood out with unusual clarity. A man in a dark suit positioned at the edge of the frame, his face turned directly toward the camera, while everyone else looked toward the courthouse steps. His features were sharp despite the photographic limitations of the era, and something about his expression, knowing, almost amused, made Vanessa pause and examine the image more closely. She flagged it for detailed scanning and moved on to the next box, working through decades of Oak Ridge history documented in silver gelatin and fading paper. The man appeared again in an 1889 photograph of Main Street during a parade. Same dark suit, same position at the frame's edge, same direct gaze toward the camera. Vanessa checked the date stamps twice, certain she'd misfiled something. But the photographs were definitely from different years, different events, different photographers based on the processing marks visible on the backs. By the end of the week, Vanessa had found him in 17 photographs, spanning from 1873 to 1952. Always at the edges, always facing the camera, always wearing variations of the same dark suit that evolved with fashion, but remained fundamentally consistent. His face didn't age. The background changed. The other people grew older or were replaced by new generations. Buildings rose and fell. But the man remained constant, appearing in Oak Ridge's photographic record like a persistent error or an intentional signature. Vanessa brought the anomaly to Roland's attention, spreading the photographs across the reading room table in chronological order, expecting the historian to be surprised or intrigued. Instead, Roland's face went pale and he gathered the photographs with shaking hands, his previous warmth replaced by something that looked like fear. "You shouldn't have found these," he said quietly. "Most researchers never notice. They're looking at the buildings, the streets, the obvious subjects. They don't pay attention to the edges." Vanessa felt her academic curiosity sharpen into something more urgent. "Who is he? Is this some kind of photographic plate error that carried across different cameras?" Roland sat down heavily, the photographs clutched against his chest as if protecting them, or protecting Vanessa from them. "His name is never recorded. He appears in our archives going back to the earliest daguerreotypes, and we have reports from portrait painters in the 1850s who mentioned a man who appeared in their background sketches uninvited. He's been part of Oak Ridge's visual history since the town was founded, and everyone who works with the historical collection eventually notices him. We call him the Witness because he seems to be documenting us while we document ourselves." Vanessa's skepticism warred with the evidence laid out before her. "That's impossible. People don't live for 200 years, appearing in random photographs." Roland's laugh was bitter and tired. "You'd think someone would have figured that out and stopped the phenomenon, wouldn't you? But he keeps appearing. We've tried to predict when and where, tried to confront him during events where we expect him to manifest, but he only shows up in the photographs after they're developed, never visible to the naked eye at the time of capture. Just there, afterward, in the permanent record." Vanessa should have left it alone, should have recognized the warning implicit in Roland's fear, and returned to her safe dissertation about architectural styles and construction materials. But academic training values inquiry over caution, and she spent the next 2 days examining every photograph in the Historical Society's collection, building a comprehensive catalog of the witness's appearances. She found him in graduation photos from 1923, in a wedding portrait from 1941, in the background of a 1967 protest against the Vietnam War, always watching, always aware of the camera, in ways the primary subjects never were. And then she found the pattern. The Witness appeared most frequently in photographs taken within 48 hours of significant deaths in Oak Ridge. He was in the background of a 4th of July celebration in 1903, 2 days before a factory explosion killed 12 workers. He appeared at the edge of a school photograph in 1956, the afternoon before a bus accident that claimed 6 children. He was visible in a town council meeting photo from 1989, the week before the mayor's sudden heart attack. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidence, and when Vanessa presented her findings to Roland, the historian's resignation deepened into something approaching despair. "You've discovered what we've known for generations," he admitted. "The Witness doesn't just appear in photographs. He appears before death. He's documenting the town's final moments with people who are about to die. And now you've seen him, really seen him, understood the pattern. That changes things. Vanessa's skin prickled with instinctive fear. What do you mean it changes things? Roland pulled out a photograph from his desk drawer, recent based on the digital timestamp, showing the Historical Society's reading room. Vanessa stood at the table examining photographs, her face clearly visible, her posture focused. And behind her, barely visible in the shadow near the archive door, was the witness. He's been in every photograph of you since you started noticing him. The security cameras, my phone when I documented your research, even the selfie you took in front of the Historical Society sign and posted to social media. He's there. He's watching you now because you've become aware of him. Vanessa grabbed the photograph, her hand shaking as she examined the shadowy figure that had indeed been hovering in the background of her own image. This doesn't mean anything. Correlation isn't causation. People die in small towns all the time. His appearance could be random. But even as she spoke, she was checking her recent photos, scrolling through her camera roll with growing horror as she found him in image after image. The coffee shop selfie from yesterday morning, the landscape shot of the town square, the photograph of her rental house she'd sent to her advisor, always there, always at the edges, always watching with that knowing expression that suggested he was aware of exactly what his presence meant. Roland stood and walked to the window, overlooking the square. 3 researchers before you noticed the pattern. All of them died within 2 weeks. Heart attack, car accident, sudden stroke. The witness documents death, but sometimes the act of noticing him, of truly seeing him, marks you for documentation. You've looked too closely at something that demands to remain peripheral. Vanessa fled Oak Ridge that afternoon, abandoning her dissertation research and her carefully organized archive materials, driving back to the university with the irrational conviction that distance would break whatever connection she'd established with the figure in the photographs. But he appeared in her rear-view mirror, visible for just a moment in the reflection before vanishing when she turned to look directly. He was in the background of a traffic camera photo that arrived as a speeding ticket 2 days later. He stood in the parking lot security footage outside her apartment building. Every photograph, every captured image now contained his presence, and Vanessa stopped allowing herself to be photographed, stopped taking pictures, removed herself from social media and surveillance, and any situation where cameras might record her existence. She knew it was futile. Knew that modern life made avoiding photographic documentation nearly impossible, but the alternative was accepting that she'd been marked, that the witness had claimed her as his next subject, that somewhere in Oak Ridge's future archives would be a photograph showing Vanessa's final moments with him, watching from the edges. The call came 3 weeks after she left Oak Ridge, Roland's voice heavy with sorrow and confirmation. You're still appearing in our current photographs. Town events, security cameras, random snapshots. You're not even here, but he's documenting you anyway, showing up wherever you are. I don't think distance matters. I think once he's seen you seeing him, the connection is permanent. Vanessa asked the question she'd been avoiding since discovering the pattern. How long do I have? Roland's silence stretched for several seconds before he answered. The shortest interval was 6 days. The longest was 11 months. But they all died, Vanessa. Everyone who truly understood what the witness was doing. I'm sorry. I tried to warn you to start with recent collections, tried to steer you away from the older photographs, where he appears most frequently. But you're a thorough researcher. That's what makes you good at your work, and that's what's going to kill you. Vanessa lived for 7 more months, every day shadowed by the awareness that the witness was documenting her approach toward death, that every photograph captured not just her present but her numbered future. She tried everything: protective rituals, technological shielding, consultations with people who claimed expertise in supernatural phenomena, but nothing prevented his appearance in images. Nothing severed the connection she'd established by seeing him, truly seeing him, understanding his purpose. When the end came, it was sudden and mundane. A brain aneurysm that medical examiners ruled as congenital and unpredictable, the kind of death that could happen to anyone at any time without warning or prevention. Roland received the news and added Vanessa's obituary to the Historical Society's collection, filing it next to the photographs where the witness had documented her final months with the same patient attention he'd given to Oak Ridge's history for 2 centuries. The dissertation remained unfinished, her research notes donated to the university archive where they gathered dust and remained unconsulted. And in Oak Ridge, the witness continues to appear in photographs, marking time and death with his peripheral presence, waiting for the next researcher who will look too closely and see him not as photographic anomaly, but as truth about mortality and documentation, and the terrible price of really understanding what lurks at the edges of captured moments. The job posting had seemed almost too good for what it was asking. $22 an hour to stand at a school crosswalk for 90 minutes each morning, Monday through Friday, helping children cross safely before classes started. Andre had applied expecting competition, but the hiring manager at Riverside Elementary seemed almost relieved when he showed up for the interview, offering him the position before he'd even finished describing his previous work experience. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Patricia, had given him the standard safety vest and stop sign, explained the hand signals and traffic patterns, and mentioned almost casually that the previous crossing guard had quit without notice, and they desperately needed someone reliable. Andre asked why the position had such high turnover, and Patricia's smile had frozen for just a moment before she'd answered that some people found early morning shifts difficult to maintain. It was a lie, Andre could tell, but $22 an hour for an hour and a half of work was too good to walk away from based on a hiring manager's nervous energy. The crosswalk was positioned at the intersection of Maple and 7th, where a residential street met the busier road that led to the elementary school's front entrance. A sharp curve 50 yards north meant drivers often came around the bend faster than the posted 25-mile-per-hour limit, and Andre's job was to stop traffic with his sign, create a safe window for children to cross, and count them to ensure everyone made it to the other side before releasing the stopped cars. Simple enough, and the first morning went smoothly, with a dozen children crossing in small groups, their parents waving gratefully from idling vehicles or walking their kids to the corner before heading to work. Andre felt good about the job, appreciated the morning air and the routine, and was considering how the extra income would help with his mother's medical bills when the second morning arrived, and everything changed. The children appeared as they had the day before, backpacks bouncing, voices bright with the particular energy of elementary school students, and Andre stopped traffic to let the first group cross. But as they reached the center line, he saw them, additional children, transparent and flickering like damaged film, walking among the solid students as if they belonged there. Andre blinked hard, assuming exhaustion or eye strain, but the transparent children remained visible, their clothing dated and wrong, styles from decades past, and their movements slightly out of sync with the present moment. They crossed with the living children, reached the opposite curb, and continued toward the school building where they faded entirely, vanishing like morning mist burned away by strengthening sunlight. Andre stood frozen, his stop sign still raised, until a driver honked impatiently, snapping him back to the present. He lowered the sign with shaking hands and watched more children approach the crosswalk, some solid and real, others flickering with that same transparent quality. And he realized with creeping horror that he was seeing 2 groups simultaneously, the current students of Riverside Elementary and something else, some echo of children who'd crossed this intersection in the past. He finished the shift in a daze, counting both the solid and transparent children automatically, his mind trying to rationalize what he was witnessing as hallucination or stress-induced vision problems. Patricia was waiting for him when his shift ended, her expression knowing and resigned. "You saw them," she said, and it wasn't a question. Andre wanted to deny it, wanted to laugh off whatever delusion had infected his perception, but Patricia's certainty made lying seem pointless. "What are they?" he managed. Patricia gestured for him to follow her inside the school, leading him to her office where she closed the door and pulled out a worn file folder labeled Crossing Guard Position, Historical Notes. Inside were incident reports, newspaper clippings, and handwritten accounts dating back to 1976, all documenting the same phenomenon Andre had just experienced. 43 years ago, a school bus carrying 17 children failed to stop at this intersection. The driver came around that curve too fast, didn't see the crossing guard sign, and hit a group of 6 children who were in the crosswalk. They all died. The bus driver, the crossing guard at the time, they survived but never recovered. The intersection was redesigned, new signals were installed, and the position of crossing guard was created specifically to prevent anything like that from happening again. Andre felt his stomach turn over. "And the transparent children I'm seeing are the ones who died?" Patricia nodded slowly. "Every crossing guard who's worked this intersection for more than a day reports seeing them. They appear mixed in with the current students, crossing at the same time, following the same patterns. And here's the part that makes this position so difficult to fill. You have to count them." She pulled out a ledger, pages filled with dates and numbers in different handwriting spanning decades. "Every morning, you count the total number of children who cross, both living and dead. The living children vary day to day, anywhere from 8 to 20 depending on carpools and absences. But the dead children are always 6. If you count wrong, if you miss even one of the ghost children in your total, something terrible happens." Andre's mouth had gone completely dry. "What happens?" Patricia's hands trembled as she opened to a page marked with red ink. "The count balances itself. If you count 5 ghost children instead of 6, a living child dies that day. Car accident, sudden illness, something that looks natural but happens within 24 hours. The universe, or fate, or whatever governs these things, ensures the number remains consistent." Andre stood up, already removing the safety vest. "This is insane. You can't expect me to participate in some supernatural bookkeeping ritual that determines whether children live or die." Patricia's expression hardened. "If you quit, the position goes unfilled until we can find someone else. And during that time, children cross without a guard, without protection, and the ghost children still appear looking for someone to count them. The last time we went 3 days without a crossing guard, 2 children were hit by cars. Not fatal, thank God, but close. This position exists for a reason, Andre. The crossing guard doesn't just protect the living children from traffic. They protect them from the debt that's been owed since 1976. Andre wanted to walk out, wanted to report this entire situation to authorities who would dismiss it as collective delusion or elaborate hazing, but the evidence in the file folder was extensive and detailed. Accounts from dozens of crossing guards over 4 decades, all describing the same phenomenon, all documenting the same terrible mathematics. He stayed, not because he believed completely, not because the $22 an hour was worth the psychological burden, but because walking away felt like abandoning children to forces he didn't understand but couldn't deny after what he'd witnessed. The 3rd morning, Andre counted carefully, watching both the solid children with their bright backpacks and the transparent children with their outdated clothing and flickering forms. 8 living children, 6 ghost children, 14 total. He marked it in the ledger and completed his shift with the weight of responsibility pressing on his chest like a physical force. By the 2nd week, he'd learned to identify the ghost children by their particular characteristics. A girl with braids who always held hands with a flickering companion, a boy in a striped shirt who lagged behind the group, twins who crossed together giggling at some joke only they could hear. They were as real to Andre as the living students, their routines as consistent, and the act of counting them felt less like supernatural duty and more like honoring their presence, acknowledging that they still mattered, even though they'd died decades before Andre was born. The morning it went wrong was a Tuesday in late October, fog rolling in, thick enough to reduce visibility and make the transparent children even harder to distinguish from the living. Andre stopped traffic and watched the children cross, counting carefully despite the conditions. 9 living children, and he saw 5 ghost children. No, 6. There was the boy in the striped shirt lagging behind as always. He recorded 14 total in the ledger and released the traffic, satisfied he'd maintained the count. But 10 minutes later, Patricia appeared at the crosswalk, her face ashen. "You miscounted," she said, her voice barely audible over the traffic. "I can feel it. Something's wrong." Andre checked his ledger, recounted the number, insisted he'd been careful. Patricia pulled out her phone, already dialing emergency services, and Andre felt reality tilt sideways as understanding crashed over him. He'd counted the boy in the striped shirt, but that child had been particularly translucent this morning, more ghost-like than usual. Had he been counting a living child or a ghost child? Had he accidentally recorded a living student as already dead, or failed to count a ghost child who needed acknowledgement? The call came through at 9:47 a.m. A student had collapsed during first period, a previously undiagnosed heart condition causing sudden cardiac arrest. The paramedics were able to revive him, but it had been close, terrifyingly close, and as Patricia relayed the information, Andre saw the boy in the striped shirt standing at the edge of the crosswalk, more solid than he'd ever appeared, almost alive. The ghost child looked directly at Andre with an expression that mixed accusation and sorrow, and Andre understood with devastating clarity that he'd failed, that his miscount had nearly created a 7th ghost child, that only luck or medical intervention had prevented the balance from claiming another life. The boy faded slowly, returning to his usual transparent state, and Andre knew he'd been given a warning, a glimpse of what would happen if he failed in his duty to maintain the count. Andre worked the crossing guard position for 3 more years, longer than any previous guard had managed, and the counting became automatic, a ritual performed with religious precision every morning regardless of weather or exhaustion. He learned to distinguish the ghost children from the living with absolute accuracy, learned to honor their presence while protecting the students who still had futures ahead of them. But the weight of it never lessened, the knowledge that a single mistake could cost a child their life, that he stood every morning at an intersection where past and present overlapped, and the dead still walked among the living, seeking acknowledgement and accurate counting. When he finally quit, it was with the understanding that he'd been part of something larger than employment, something that connected tragedy and prevention in ways that defied explanation but demanded participation. The ledger he left behind contained 3 years of perfect counts, a record of mornings where he'd successfully maintained the balance between the living and the dead, and somewhere in that accounting was the life of one child who'd almost joined the ghost children, but had been pulled back from the edge by medical science, and perhaps by Andre's dedication to getting the numbers right. The rental house in Bridgewater seemed almost too perfect when Melissa and her husband David found it listed online. 3 bedrooms, updated kitchen, quiet street in a town small enough to avoid urban problems, but large enough to have basic amenities. They'd been planning the move for months, David's new job requiring relocation from Portland, and their 7-year-old daughter Sophie was excited about the prospect of a yard and neighbors and a slower pace of life than the apartment complex had offered. The welcome began before they'd finished unloading the moving truck. A woman appeared with a casserole, introducing herself as Janet from 3 houses down, followed within minutes by a couple named Frank and Linda, bearing homemade cookies and enthusiastic questions about where the family was from and how long they planned to stay. By evening, 8 different neighbors had stopped by with food, offers of assistance, and an intensity of friendliness that felt overwhelming but presumably normal for small-town culture. The Welcome Committee, as Janet called it, organized a block party for that first Saturday, insisting that new neighbors needed proper introduction to the community. Melissa appreciated the gesture, even as she felt slightly smothered by the attention, the constant knocking on the door, the way neighbors seemed to appear whenever she stepped outside to check the mail or water the flower beds that the previous owners had left thriving, despite the house being vacant for 6 months. David laughed off her concerns, called her paranoid from too many years of city living, where neighbors ignored each other, and Sophie was delighted by the other children on the block who'd immediately included her in their games and bike rides. The block party was elaborate for a casual neighborhood gathering. Tables of food, decorations, a banner reading, "Welcome Melissa, David, and Sophie," hung between 2 oak trees. Everyone attended, smiling and chatting, and asking questions that felt detailed beyond polite curiosity. What were their routines? What time did David leave for work? Did Melissa have family nearby? Did Sophie have any allergies or medical conditions? The questions were framed as neighborly concern, but something in the way people recorded mental notes made Melissa uneasy. The second week brought more gifts, more visits, more invitations to join book clubs, and coffee meetups and community organizations. Janet appeared at the door with a questionnaire she claimed was for the neighborhood directory, asking for detailed information about schedules, preferences, habits. Melissa filled it out feeling slightly ridiculous for her growing paranoia, but that night she noticed something that transformed unease into genuine fear. Through the kitchen window, she saw Frank standing in his yard, staring at their house with binoculars, watching not with casual interest but with focused intensity, as if studying and memorizing. When Melissa mentioned it to David, he suggested Frank was birdwatching or stargazing, offered explanations that sounded reasonable until Melissa checked and found Frank's binoculars pointing directly at their bedroom window, at their daughter's room, with precision that had nothing to do with wildlife observation. The breaking point came when Sophie mentioned that the neighborhood children had been asking strange questions during their games, what Melissa looked like when she first woke up, what David's voice sounded like when he was angry, whether Sophie had any birthmarks or scars that made her distinctive. The questions were supposedly for a game called Family Matching that the kids played, but when Melissa asked other parents about it, they smiled too widely and changed the subject too quickly. That night, unable to sleep, Melissa went to the garage to retrieve a box they hadn't unpacked yet, and she found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden behind their moving boxes covered with a tarp were belongings that didn't belong to them: children's toys, adult clothing, framed photographs of a family Melissa didn't recognize. The items were arranged carefully, as if stored with intention rather than abandoned, and when Melissa looked closer at the photographs, she recognized the house in the background. Their house. The family in the photos had lived here before them, and their possessions were still here, hidden but present, waiting. Melissa woke David, showed him the hidden cash, and insisted they search the house thoroughly. What they found in the next hour destroyed any remaining illusion of normal small-town hospitality. Inside the walls of the master bedroom closet, accessible through a panel that wasn't visible unless you knew where to look, they found more belongings from the previous family. Journals, personal documents, items so intimate that their presence felt like violation. The journals were written by a woman named Rebecca, and the final entries detailed growing paranoia about the neighbors, about feeling watched and studied, about the welcome committee asking questions that felt like preparation rather than friendliness. The last entry was dated 6 months ago. They're not being welcoming. They're learning us, learning how to be us. I told Marcus we need to leave, but he says I'm imagining things. The children on the block have been measuring Sophie's height. Janet asked about the scar on my left shoulder. Frank was in our yard at 3 a.m., just standing there watching the house. Something is wrong with Bridgewater. Something is wrong with everyone here. Melissa felt reality tilt sideways. Sophie was their daughter's name. The scar on her own left shoulder matched the description. The previous family had the same composition as theirs, parents and a 7-year-old daughter. This wasn't coincidence. This was pattern, preparation, selection. David wanted to call the police, but Melissa's instinct screamed that involving local authorities in a town where every neighbor seemed complicit would only accelerate whatever was happening. They decided to leave immediately, to pack essentials and drive away that night. But when David tried to start the car, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead despite being new, and when he popped the hood, they saw that someone had removed crucial components, sabotaged the vehicle so subtly that it would look like mechanical failure rather than intentional disabling. They were trapped, and as Melissa looked out the window, she saw neighbors emerging from their houses, standing in yards and on sidewalks, watching their home with expressions that had shed all pretense of friendliness. Janet knocked on the door at midnight, her smile sharp in the porch light. "We know you found Rebecca's things. We know you understand now. It's better this way, actually. The families who fight are harder to replace than the families who accept." Melissa stood in the doorway with David behind her and Sophie sleeping upstairs, unaware of the nightmare her parents had stumbled into. "Replace for what? What are you?" Janet's expression shifted, her features seeming to blur and resettle into a configuration that was almost but not quite human. "We've been here longer than Bridgewater has been a town. We've lived in these houses since the settlement was founded, and we've learned that the best way to remain unnoticed is to be exactly what people expect. Small-town neighbors, friendly, consistent. But faces age, and bodies fail, and we need to update our appearances periodically to maintain the illusion. Every few years, we select a family that matches our composition. We study them, learn their mannerisms, their speech patterns, their relationships, and then we replace them. We become them, and they become what we were, stored away in the walls until we need to replace again." Melissa tried to close the door, but Frank had appeared behind Janet, his form also shifting into something inhuman, joints bending in ways that defied anatomy. "The previous family's still here," Frank said, his voice layered with harmonics that hurt to hear. "They're in the crawlspace beneath your daughter's room. Not dead. We're not cruel, but changed, transformed into earlier versions of ourselves, holding the place we'll return to when your faces grow old, and we need new ones. It's a cycle. You replace us at the surface while we replace you in the depths. And then, in 20 years, when we've worn your appearances enough to need updating, we'll find another family, and the cycle continues." Melissa grabbed the phone to call for help, but the line was dead, and David's cell phone showed no signal, despite having full bars an hour earlier. They were isolated, cut off, surrounded by neighbors who'd shed their human disguises to reveal something ancient and patient and utterly committed to the deception they'd maintained for centuries. Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing her eyes and asking why everyone was awake. Janet's transformed face softened with something that might have been genuine affection. The children adjust fastest. They forget their old lives within weeks and adopt our patterns without the resistance adults show. Sophie will be happy here. She'll play with the other children, learn the games, and by the time she's grown, she won't remember being anyone other than who we teach her to be. Melissa moved to grab her daughter, but the neighbors were inside now, filling the house with their presence, their forms shifting between human and something older, something that had learned to wear human appearance like clothing, but had never truly been human at all. David fought. Melissa screamed, but the neighbors were strong with the strength of things that had survived by hiding in plain sight for longer than America had been a country. The last thing Melissa remembered before darkness took her was Sophie's confused crying and Janet's gentle reassurance that everything would be fine, that the child would be cared for, that the family would continue just in a different form beneath the earth, while the welcome committee wore their faces and lived their lives and welcomed the next family to Bridgewater with casseroles and cookies and questions designed to learn every detail necessary for perfect replacement. The house on Maple Street in Bridgewater remained occupied by a family matching the description of Melissa, David, and Sophie, and neighbors continued to report them as friendly and well-adjusted. The welcome committee moved on to other preparations, already researching the next family, who would fit their needs, already planning the hospitality and questions and slow revelation that would lead to the next cycle of replacement. And beneath the houses of Bridgewater, in crawl spaces and hidden chambers, previous families existed in transformed states, their consciousness preserved, but their identities consumed by beings who'd perfected the art of imitation over centuries of practice. The pattern continued, the cycle repeated, and small-town hospitality remained the perfect camouflage for something that had never been human learning to be more human than the people it replaced. The documentary was supposed to be straightforward. Interview the last holdout in Harmony Falls, the single resident who'd refused evacuation when the EPA declared the town uninhabitable after decades of industrial contamination had poisoned the water table and soil beyond remediation. Casey had driven 6 hours into rural Pennsylvania to meet Marcus Tolliver, the 73-year-old man who'd become a minor internet legend for his stubborn refusal to abandon the house where he'd lived for 50 years. The pitch for the documentary had practically written itself, a meditation on attachment to place, on what home means when the land itself becomes toxic, on American individualism pushed to its logical extreme. Casey expected to spend 3 days filming, capturing Marcus's daily routine and his philosophical justifications for staying, then return to New York with footage that would play well at festivals and generate the kind of buzz that might finally launch a career stuck in freelance purgatory. The town looked exactly as the EPA reports had described: empty streets, boarded windows, vegetation growing wild through cracked asphalt, the particular desolation that comes from sudden abandonment rather than gradual decline. Marcus's house stood at the end of Birch Street, a modest ranch with a neat yard and smoke rising from the chimney despite the afternoon warmth. He greeted Casey at the door with a handshake that was firm and a smile that looked genuine, inviting the filmmaker inside with hospitality that seemed out of place in a condemned town. The interior was clean, well-maintained, furnished with the kind of accumulated possessions that come from decades of life lived in one location. Marcus offered coffee and explained his decision to stay with reasoning Casey had heard before in preliminary phone interviews. He'd been born in Harmony Falls, had raised his family here, had buried his wife in the town cemetery, and no government agency was going to force him from the place that contained his entire history. It was compelling in its simplicity, the kind of narrative that documentaries loved, and Casey began filming with the confidence that this would be straightforward character study with clear emotional arc. But something felt wrong in ways Casey couldn't immediately identify. A dissonance between Marcus's words and the atmosphere of the house, between his apparent contentment and the way his eyes kept darting toward the windows as if watching for something. The first night, Casey stayed in what Marcus called the guest room, a space that looked recently prepared despite the man's claim that he hadn't had visitors in 2 years. The bed was made with hospital corners, the dresser empty and waiting, and Casey fell asleep thinking about interview questions and shot compositions. The sound woke him at 2:17 a.m. according to his phone, scratching at the bedroom window, rhythmic and insistent, accompanied by breathing that was too loud and too wet to be animal or wind. Casey lay frozen, staring at the dark window, where something moved on the other side of the glass, something that pressed against the pane with force enough to make it flex inward. The scratching continued for 10 minutes that felt like hours before whatever was outside moved away, its retreat marked by footsteps that were too heavy and too numerous to belong to anything Casey's rational mind could categorize. In the morning, Marcus served breakfast as if nothing unusual had happened, asked Casey about the filming schedule, and seemed genuinely confused when Casey mentioned the nighttime disturbance. "Must have been deer," Marcus said with a dismissive wave. "They get curious sometimes, nothing to worry about." But Casey had seen the window in daylight, had photographed the scratches gouged deep into the wooden frame, marks that suggested claws or fingers or something in between, and deer didn't leave residue that looked like the mucus trails of something without proper skin. The filming continued through the second day, Marcus demonstrating his routine, tending his garden where nothing would grow in contaminated soil, checking his mail though no postal service delivered to Harmony Falls anymore, maintaining the house with the dedication of someone who believed normalcy could be preserved through routine alone. Casey captured it all, the footage building a portrait of determined denial, but the wrongness intensified with each hour. The food Marcus served came from cans dated years past expiration. The newspaper he read at breakfast was from 2019, yellowed and brittle. The phone he answered when it rang had no cord, no connection, and Casey heard only silence through the receiver when Marcus handed it over, claiming it was Casey's producer checking in. These inconsistencies accumulated until the truth became unavoidable. Marcus wasn't choosing to stay in Harmony Falls. He was being kept here, maintained in a simulation of normalcy by something that wanted him to believe he was living independently. The confrontation happened on the third night when Casey found Marcus standing in the backyard staring into the forest that pressed against the property line. "You need to leave," Marcus said without turning around, his voice different now, stripped of the folksy warmth he'd maintained for the camera. "You need to get in your car and drive away and never come back to Harmony Falls." Casey asked why, asked what was really happening, and Marcus finally turned, his face showing terror that had been carefully hidden beneath the performance of contentment. "I can't leave. I tried that first week after the evacuation. I got in my car and drove to the town line and something stopped me. Not physically, mentally. I couldn't make myself cross the boundary. And when I came back, it was waiting. The thing that lives in the contamination, the thing that grew from whatever chemicals the plant leaked into the ground. It feeds on presence, on human occupation, and when everyone left, I was all that remained. So it kept me. It maintains the house, stocks the pantry with simulations of food, creates the illusion of normal life because it needs me to stay, needs at least one person here to justify its existence." Casey's camera was recording, capturing this confession, and Marcus noticed with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You think you'll take this footage back to New York and reveal what's happening here? You think anyone will believe you? The thing that keeps me knows you're here. It's been watching since you arrived, deciding whether you're a visitor or another resident. And the more you film, the more you document, the more you're creating evidence of your own occupation. You're building a case for why you should stay too." Casey backed toward the house, toward the car parked in the driveway, but Marcus grabbed their arm with strength that seemed impossible for his age. "It's too late. You stayed 3 nights. That's the threshold. That's when visitors become residents. I'm sorry. I tried to warn you subtly, tried to be off-putting enough that you'd leave early, but you're too dedicated to your work, too committed to the documentary, and now the thing in the contamination has decided you belong here too." The thing emerged from the forest as full darkness fell, and Casey finally saw what had been scratching at the window, what had been maintaining Marcus's prison of false normalcy. It had no definite form, shifting between states like liquid and solid, its surface reflecting the contaminated ground that had birthed it. Faces pressed against its membrane from the inside. Previous residents of Harmony Falls who'd tried to return, who'd been unable to resist the pull of home, who'd been absorbed into the entity that had claimed the town as its territory. The thing surrounded the house, cut off escape, and Casey felt the same mental barrier Marcus had described, the inability to even conceive of leaving, of crossing the town boundary, back into the world, where Harmony Falls was safely quarantined and forgotten. Marcus led Casey back inside with the resignation of someone who'd performed this role before. There were two others before you, a journalist in 2021 and an urban explorer in 2023. The thing keeps us separated, maintains individual houses, preserves the illusion that we're choosing this. But we're all residents now. We're all part of Harmony Falls' permanent population, and the contamination feeds on our presence, grows stronger with each person it claims. Casey spent that night watching the thing patrol the property line, its form growing more solid and defined with each hour, as if Casey's presence was indeed feeding it, giving it substance. By morning, the mental barrier was absolute. The thought of leaving caused physical pain, nausea, and vertigo that made movement beyond the property impossible. Marcus appeared with coffee and sympathy. You adjust. Eventually. The thing maintains the illusion well enough that you can pretend life is normal if you don't look too closely at the details. We each get our own house, our own routines. Sometimes I see the journalist walking her property 3 streets over. Sometimes I hear the urban explorer trying to break down his door, but mostly we exist in isolation, separated prisoners in a town that died but refuses to acknowledge its death. Casey understood then that the documentary would never be finished, that the footage would never be seen, that the career launch and festival buzz were fantasies from a life that had ended the moment the town boundary was crossed 3 nights ago. The months that followed were exactly as Marcus had described, routine maintained through force of will, normalcy performed for an audience of one, the slow acceptance that Harmony Falls had claimed another resident and would keep claiming them until the contamination itself was cleaned, or the last memory of the town finally faded from existence. Casey still films sometimes, documenting the days with equipment that no longer holds charge, creating footage that plays back as static and white noise. The documentary about Marcus Tolliver remains unfinished, its subject living 3 houses away, invisible occasionally through the fog that rises from contaminated ground, 2 prisoners waving at each other across the distance to the thing maintaining their captivity enforces. And in Harmony Falls, the population remains constant at 4, growing slowly as the years pass, and others make the mistake of entering a town that refuses to release anyone who stays too long, who documents too thoroughly, who crosses the threshold from visitor to resident and finds that some places hold on with grip that can't be broken by will or want or the desperate need to escape. If you made it through all 13 stories, you're stronger than most. These are the tales from America's small towns where darkness hides behind hospitality and horror waits in the spaces we think are safe. Subscribe to Verified Souls for more terrifying encounters. Hit that like button if these stories kept you up at night, and share with friends who dare to listen. Because in small towns across this country, something is always watching, always waiting, always ready to claim the next person who wanders too close to the truth.